Being out in the desert, it's not uncommon to see strange things. Lights in the sky, weird sounds, even beings. And I have an account that is absolutely terrifying to the core. In fact, I'm sure you may not even believe me, but all my friends who were at this bonfire can testify that what we experienced was something of the evil supernatural realm. So let's clear out some details first. We're all about 1819, and since the pandemic, we've been driven crazy. So on this night, we were looking to go out into the desert and just have some fun, away from being locked in, and our parents, of course. It was a group of about 7 of us. Me, my girlfriend, a buddy of mine, his girlfriend, a couple mutual friends, and one of their family members. And so we drive out to this small area that's not too far from home, build a pretty good bonfire, and, of course, like any 18-year-olds do, bring some booze and some snacks, and get ready to have just a fun night of just letting loose, because we were all getting pretty tired of being stuck inside, for one. This was actually, too, about a year ago. Maybe last June, or maybe last May. It was still right when the pandemic was in the thick of everything. So we got the bonfire going, we're having a good time, cutting up, laughing, and talking. I think none of us had had dinner yet, so we were eating some snacks and just talking. We did have beer set aside, but nobody at this point had even drunk yet. And, for whatever reason unknown, my friend's family member, we'll call him Craig, starts talking about skinwalkers, which really creeped all the rest of us out. Because the conversation was, I think, about some funny memories or something, and he just starts talking and going on about skinwalkers, something some of us had never even heard about. And then my buddy is like, you shouldn't talk about them, you're going to draw the energy of them here. And even more so being nighttime, all alone in the desert night. They start bickering and arguing back and forth, and then my girlfriend and his girlfriend start to get really creeped out, while the rest of us are trying to tone it down. I mean, the argument or discussion got pretty heated. It ended up with them calling each other a few names and voices rising for sure. But maybe after 5 or so minutes, we're able to calm both of them down and successfully change the topic of conversation. But it doesn't seem like that lasted long, because Craig just shut up altogether and just sat there. Just as I start to feel the good vibes coming back, of everybody smiling and laughing again, we all 7 of us, hear this sound of what appears to be large, multiple animals coming towards us, but staying and circling around the fire, like they were just outside the light of the fire, by, I don't know, a couple car lengths, however many feet that is. And this was maybe 20-some odd minutes after the initial conversation of skinwalkers was started. And we all hear it, and so we all turn around, looking for the source of this noise, and whatever animal or animals are making them. It kind of reminded me personally of a couple of loose cows, except extremely aggressive with the way their footsteps were, but they did not sound bipedal. It was definitely 4 legs, and there was at least 5 or 6 of them, just kept circling us around the fire. We try not to think much of it, like maybe it was just some loose cattle, or maybe horses. There's got to be a reason for it, right? But as time went on, and by time I mean 5-10 minutes, we're trying our best to ignore this, but the noises, all the strange sounds are just getting more and more apparent. Like the hoof sounds, or so it sounded like, the snorting, the hissing, even growling. And not long after, we are all freaking out. So, one of our buddies decided he was going to walk the quarter-mile or so back to the car to grab an adequate flashlight and expose these, what he thought were loose steer for what they were. So he starts jogging back the direction of the cars, and not even 2 minutes later, comes sprinting back towards the fire, and we see him running from a distance, and so we're calling out to him, asking, What's wrong? What happened?" And he runs right up to the fire, and he is pale as a ghost. I had never seen Devin this way. I'll call him Devin for the sake of the story. He was as pale as a sheet, and he looks at us all in the eyes, and his eyes are about as big as a plate, and he keeps saying that he was chased. And we're like, "What? What do you mean chased?" He said that he got a good look at those things, because one or two of them broke off from the other few and followed him as he walked towards the car in the night. He said that he kind of saw what it was. He described it as being half man, half reptile, but that it was skeletal looking. And he was all choked up and scared and shaking as he's telling us this. Now, the entire night, multiple of these things continued to circle around us. Maybe, I don't know, if I had to guess, 30 feet beyond the light of the fire. But they would never get closer than that. Even as the fire died down, we'd already planned on being out here most of the night anyway, until the early wee morning hours, so we had plenty of wood. That wasn't the problem. We were just terrified to leave the light of the fire, and the entire night was incredibly fearful, unexpected, and unsure of what was going to happen to us. I think at some point we all decided that we're just going to have to stay within the light of the bonfire until light. We don't have a choice. And I've never in my life felt like I was living in a real Hollywood horror movie until this night. And at some point, a huge argument, which turned into a fist fight with Craig and a couple of my buddies, ensued, because the buddy, not the one that saw this thing and walked to the car, but the other one, flipped out on Craig saying, "You caused this, you brought these things here to us because you mentioned skinwalkers." And the fist fight ensued. They're fighting, rolling back and forth. We had to break that up, and it seemed like whatever these things were really drawn to the violence. Like it excited them, I guess if you want to call it that. It was very strange. But we were basically forced to stay up all night and keep the fire going until there was just enough light. And as the dawn came, and just enough light peeked over the horizon to expose somewhat beyond the light of the fire, we didn't see anything. So maybe whatever it was knew that the sun was coming up and retreated. Either that or they were very well camouflaged. So we put out the bonfire as soon as we had enough light to run back to the car, and we all bolted. And it's not like we were anywhere special. We'd all just pulled randomly off the side of a road at a spot we all thought would work. And if you have the car, you could look out and see clearly right where a bonfire was. Like I said, you're out here in the desert. It's flat. There ain't nothing to hide behind. And that was the last time we've done a bonfire. I still talk to my friends, but we've not done anything like that since, at least at night. And as a matter of fact, I just tried mentioning this probably about a week ago because the story popped up in my head and I felt like talking to one of my buddies and wanted assurance that that actually happened. He flat out refused to acknowledge that it even happened. I've not spent any time questioning any of my other friends who were there, asking them, "What do you think? Did you see the same thing?" But I feel like if we had to stand witness for it, we all could, which is why I stand by what I originally did in my opening paragraph. There was more than just me. We all experienced this hell as a group. No matter how terrifying it may have been. Oh, and one last thing I need to include. If you do decide to read this story, which I'm not sure if you will, please leave my real name out of this. Thank you. I'm only 1/4 native, Chickasaw to be specific. My grandfather, who the majority of this story is going to be about, married a white Slovakian woman, and he, of course, was full-blooded Chickasaw. He's got all sorts of terrifying tales of a creature that he saw, that he described going from being a man to shape-shifting into this reptile-like thing, or as he called it specifically, the man-dragon, because of how terrifyingly fierce that it looked. It was also extremely violent to not towards just him, but the tribe itself, and any man that it came across. It was full of bloodlust. He says that the entity, although disguised itself as a man, distinctly still looked different and tried to blend in with the tribe, but everybody knew what it was, and it was always opted out. On several occasions, it had tried to kill several of his grandfather's siblings and other fellow tribe members back in the day, and at one point, they just stopped seeing it altogether, and that was the end of that. It really makes you wonder exactly what it is they experienced and saw. It got to such an extreme, though, that the tribe, at one point or another, had sent about 3 of their top warriors to go after this thing. They returned unsuccessful and were not able to locate it, but that at nighttime, this creature would slowly find its way within the village and often try and attack several of the tribe's members, if not steal the children and attack the women. Really anybody it could. The tribes knew this thing as some sort of reptilian shapeshifter creature, or the shapeshifter dragon, they often referred to it as, in the Chickasaw native tongue. Because I'm only like 1/4 native, I don't know enough about my own culture to really understand the language that much, since it was never spoken to me. Although my grandfather has taught me some of the language, very small amounts though. My parents, and even he, mostly talks to me in English. I'm just glad I never had to see this thing myself. And I guess other tribes in the entire Oklahoma area and northern Texas also have written and verbal stories passed down of the Dragon Man and how it has the ability to take shape and form of people and can shapeshift at will. Knowing the very limited amount of knowledge I do about my own culture and my own people, is it possible that this is some sort of skinwalker, or maybe something else entirely? I don't know. I mean, my people do have a lot of stories about Bigfoot too, and dogmen, puckwudgies, and several other cryptid-like creatures, even flying ones, and ones that live in the water. My people even had lakes that were marked as not safe because of certain beings that lived in them and dwelt at the bottom of the lake. Is it possible that this dragon man surrounded itself in the woods nearby and was just waiting until the right time to strike? Which it probably never got, because my people pursued it endlessly until it just stopped coming around. These are questions I'll probably never have the answer to, and my father doesn't have many answers to them either, or my grandfather, but it's something I look to explore more of, and hopefully come back to you with a lot more terrifying stories. This was back in 2016. I was with my friend Josh on a run in the Pine Barrens in southern New Jersey. It was a cool autumn morning. The sun was out, and the leaves were just starting to change color. And it was the perfect morning for a run. We were running a trail, just for exercise and to get some good fresh air. A nice brisk pace always helps the body. And this particular trail was slightly challenging, with it being uphill. We were both talking about how nice it was out and how much we enjoyed being out here in the woods. So, here's a quick note, before I go any further with my story. Yes, I'm aware that Pine Barrens is home to all sorts of strange stories and encounters. Things like UFO sightings and bright lights, alien abductions, Bigfoots, and yes, even the Jersey Devil. I've heard it all, but I've never experienced anything myself. Never seen anything, never felt anything weird, and I've lived here for a long time. Not all my life, but enough time in the Pine Barrens, hiking and running around, that I feel like if those things were true, I would have seen something, at least by now. Well, that mentality that I had was proven wrong this day. As I was saying, we were running on this trail when, up ahead of us, we see something. Now bear in mind here, this is what we saw. We saw something big climbing out of the ground. At first, we kind of stopped thinking, what is this? But it happened very fast. This large, lizard-like thing pulled itself out of the ground within a matter of seconds, like it just kind of dug itself out Think of how in the movies where it shows, zombies digging themselves out of a grave and pulling themselves up. It was similar to that, but it was way faster. It was like a slick, solid motion of just arms out, body coming up out of the ground, boom. I feel like the phrase pooping bricks is a severe understatement to how Josh and I felt. We were frozen, as this being had pulled itself out of the ground, and its expression was kind of stunned and shocked that we were there, like it wasn't sure how to react to the fact that we had seen it. And we were kind of just locked in this stare for, I don't know, maybe 5 seconds, before Josh just grabs me and takes off going the opposite direction. My body reacted and we both ran as fast as we could. Somehow, we managed not to scream, and I'm really surprised I didn't scream like a little girl after seeing what we did. We get all the way back down the trail and get back to the parking lot, where we stop and try to catch our breath. After heaving and breathing heavily, maybe a minute goes by and we're finally able to breathe enough to where we can ask each other, "What was that? Did you see that? Oh my gosh, oh my gosh." And yeah, I can't believe we saw that. What was that? None of us knew. None of us could even think about what it could have been. Like I told you already, I have lived here for at least 10 plus years and have never even heard or seen of anything remotely like that. Let me give you a good description of what it was, since we had such a good view of it. This thing was a dark green, almost black, and it was covered in scales. It had a body similar to a man, but very large clawed hands and feet, and the head was almost kind of like a velociraptor, at least in shape. The eyes were a very contrasty yellow, very piercing, actually. We never saw any teeth, but I guess the best description, I would call it, is a dinosaur man, because it was like half man, half dinosaur, I guess. I also didn't see its teeth, but this thing was also ripped. I mean, through its scales, you could see its rippling muscles, all over its arms, all over its chest and stomach. I did not see any genitalia. It was not wearing any clothing or anything to cover that. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to go back in those woods to find out, if we're honest. We lived very close to a wetland down south, and we had a collie that had a talent for finding the messiest, most rancid filth in the swamp and bringing it home. Our yard, our porch, and from time to time, our house looked like it had been attacked by a large terrestrial slug, leaving a slime trail everywhere and on everything. I usually did not bother scolding her for her swamp-going habits, but one day, I came home to a bigger and uglier mess than usual. I couldn't even tell what she had gotten into, but it was beyond horrible. It was thick enough to be rubber cement, and it was foul as sewage. A wide trail of it went up to the porch, and to my horror, through an open window. I didn't know who left the window open, but I decided that they were in just as much trouble as the dog. Then, I had a moment of genuine double-take. Here came the dog, delighted to see me from behind me. She was completely clean. I grew fearful, wondering what had gotten inside the house through the window. I opened the front door, called out to my husband, to which I got no answer. It hurt to look at what happened inside the house. It was utterly ruined. That foul, rubbery slime was everywhere in the thick trails. I wondered if some kind of giant slug had gotten in. I stopped in my tracks when I saw the melted remains of a body on the sofa. The bones were intact, but the flesh and the innards looked to be liquefied, dissolved. I didn't need a team of forensics to tell me that it was my husband. I knew instantly. Vomiting, my vision going blurry, grief and nausea both crushing me at once. I called the police as soon as I could. They didn't take long to come and have a look around. They followed this slime trail to the house and out the back door, which had somehow been eaten through, though it looked like it had been eaten with something corrosive, like a strong acid. I was so beside myself with the shock and disgust that it's a wonder that I can even remember anything that happened. The investigators were just as baffled as I was. There was no way that I could have cooked up acid and dissolved my husband like that. Not in my kitchen. Not without access to some closely controlled chemicals that required very specific and delicate handling. I looked at the trail that led away from the house for a very long time. Something was out there that ate my husband, and I never knew what it was. I was powerless to help him. I moved away as soon as I could. The dog came with me. If you live next to a wetland or similar, don't you ever think you are completely safe, or that alligators are all that you have to ever worry about. I had chosen to take my mindfulness practice outdoors. Granted, there were more ways to get distracted in the great outdoors, but I was tired of the stale indoor environment. The facility I worked at was built close to a marsh, and as many people thought that the marsh was gross or creepy, I thought it to be relaxing. The oxygen that came out of such a place was rich with the purest of pure. They were full of life and green and noise. So, yeah, it would be distracting, but it would be a change of pace for my meditation routine. To my surprise, it wasn't that hard to achieve a state of meditation while listening to the sounds of the marsh. If anything, it made it easier. Somehow, it all blended together. I was counting my breaths in the usual technique when I got a funny feeling on the back of my neck. I can't really describe it, looking back, but it was something like a chill or a disturbance, like something just wasn't quite right. I opened my eyes, and I was still seated at the picnic table that was at the edge of the marsh. But, suspended over the water, were 3 wispy flames of green and blue. Swamp gas. I was seeing swamp gas. I had heard about marsh lights, but I never thought I'd ever live to see them. Some people don't even believe they exist. I was thrilled. But while I was smiling to myself, one flame of swamp gas floated from around behind me, where the chill had been felt. My elation turned to a heavy, ominous feeling. Swamp gas is supposed to be just that. Combusting gas escaping the water. How was that puff of flame positioned behind me where there hadn't been any gas to combust, let alone any water? I stayed away from the water for a few days and came back, having finally shrugged off that creepy feeling that I had gotten. After another meditation session at the marsh's edge, I opened my eyes, and the lights were there again, only there were more of them. A few hovered over the water, while the rest of them flew around me in a circle. I was quite freaked out. I ran, swatting them out of my face when I had to pass through the ring around me. My actual home is far away from any marshes or wetlands, but I will wake up several times through the night, just in time to see a ray of blue or green light passing through my curtains, just before winking out. And I have no idea what to do now. I did have some people tell me that meditation came with certain risks, but I had no idea that this is what they might have had in mind. I'm a delivery driver, and I got a huge freezer truck that I take from warehouses to grocery stores all over the country. I get to see some funny things now and again. Most of them I just put down to trick of the eyes, but maybe I'm mighty tired. But the thing that lives out in the swamps around here, I've seen him like 3 or 4 times now. I know I ain't making him up. I only see him when I have my real late night or early morning shift. He must be shy during the day, or doesn't like it when it's too hot. Maybe. Can't say I blame him. He never comes close to the truck. Just seems to pop out of the water. Never really moves. Ain't never tried to rush at me in the truck or nothing. I don't feel any fear when I see him. And this last time, I raised my hand, gave him a quick salute. Why not? Doesn't cost anything to have good manners. The only thing that gets me is the smell. The swamps stink really bad anyway, but when old honey pops up, that smell gets about 10 times worse. Oh, I call him Honey, on account of it being Honey Lake swamps around here. I'd say he'd be really tall if he came out of the water. Looks to me like he stands up, or maybe treading water. He's kind of got a face like a monkey, really hairy, dark in color, and sometimes bright yellow eyes. But the rest of his body, from what I can see, is kind of scaly. Old Honey kind of looks like a monkey crossed with an alligator, and he just pops up out of the water and watches me drive past in my truck. I seen a whole lot of weird stuff in my time on the road, but ain't nothing quite as unusual as Old Honey. When you live somewhere like Georgia, you know you gotta be careful of the swamps. Not only should you always be careful around water anyway, but there are all sorts of creatures out there. Of course, I'm referring to snakes and gators, things that will bite you and hurt you. I didn't think that I'd ever be telling you about the time I saw a skunk ape. At least I think that's what it was, and can't think of a single other logical explanation. And boy, have I tried. I'm always careful if I go down there, and would never go into the actual swamps. Plus, they stink. Like rotting eggs or something. But I was there for a project I was doing at school, and I needed some photos. So I jumped in my mother's car and driven it out there just to take a few artistic shots. I just about finished up when the smell suddenly got a whole lot worse. Sometimes, my dad goes fishing, and this was like when he left a whole load of fish guts in the garage, and we had a heat wave. Super gross. I'd gotten out of the car to take the pictures, and now with my hand over my mouth and nose, I was about to jump back in when I heard all this commotion from behind me. Some of the big vines in the swamp. It led out on the other side to a huge forest, and it sounded like something had come bounding into the swamp from over there and was just about to appear from behind the vegetation. I knew I should have gotten straight back in the car and driven off, but my curiosity was piqued. I just had to know what was out there. That's when I saw it. My best description of the thing would be this. It looked to be around my height, so maybe just a little over 5 feet. Very stocky, covered in reddish dark hair, except for around its eyes, which kind of looked like it had these 2 big bare patches of skin. It kind of looked like an ape, which is where I guess it gets its name, the skunk ape, from. The skunk part is totally accurate too, as this thing was the mustiest smell I've ever smelt. I just stood staring at it when it made a sudden movement and near scared the hell out of me. However, it wasn't directed at me. I saw it grab a snake out of the swamp water and just start munching into it. Then, it just started grabbing at the water and eating whatever it found. It was like a buffet out here for it. I must have stood and watched for about 5 minutes before I thought to myself, hey, I got a camera here. Why don't I take a shot? And don't you know it? As if it had read my mind, the very second I put the camera up to my face to try and get a decent focus, it disappeared. I guess these things remain a mystery for a reason. This one sure seemed camera shy. I've heard stories about them being really aggressive, but this one seemed just fine munching on whatever it could find out in the swamps. In my early teens, my brother and I would always go out to the backwoods to hunt for treasure. We often implored the use of a metal detector. We found all sorts of cool but useless stuff in hindsight. Bottle caps, old knives, cans, forks, things like that. Nothing too exciting, but as a teenager, it was like striking gold. The adventure would usually start with us being out after dark, coming home muddy and exhausted. I mean, hey, it got us out to the woods and burned a lot of calories in the process. I guess this is why we always stayed in shape, which would come in handy for what would happen in this story. Let me just take a brief moment and explain the layout of the land. Our father owned a vast amount of acreage on the backside of our property. You had multiple creeks, and it kind of dipped down and you go further and further back, and then the land kind of goes up into a hill. Once you get to the top of this gradual slope, you could go back down again into a deeper section of valley that was all just forest upon forest. Now, during the fall season, my father would use these areas as hunting, and even had multiple deer stands set up all throughout there. My brother and I never really ventured that far out. I mean, we're talking hundreds of acres here. So, we generally stayed within maybe a mile or two at most of our own house. Don't quote me on the distance thing though. I really have no way to verify that measurement. It's just from my recollection. So, we often had this evening ritual. We'd be out there pretty much all day, playing and trying to look for stuff to hunt for treasure with, and of course, using our trusty metal detector. By about evening time, sometimes we would sit and relax, my brother and I, on top of the far back large hill, and just kind of hear the crickets slowly fade into the night, and see the weather and sky change. It was always really peaceful. Sometimes, well, more often than not, we would actually see foxes and deer. I can't dismiss it that it was really cool. But there was one night that I feel for me and my brother, but I can't speak for him. It kind of changed things. So, we had a fairly normal day of hunting for treasure, and again, I don't believe we found anything extraordinary, at least not that I can recall. We were doing our usual of sitting atop this large hill, looking out into the night valley, or should I say almost night. That's when we started to hear sounds from the hill below us, something big moving around. My brother was the first one to hear it, as it got his attention first. He starts looking in that direction and knocks me on the shoulder, saying, "Hey, listen." And you could hear something big moving around. We thought it might be a buck or something, just due to the amount of noise it was making. But you could hear it was moving. And you could hear it wasn't walking, like the way a deer would. It was two-legged, whatever it was. And so now we're both really curious, trying to look through the trees and see if we can see anything. But we don't see anything. At this point, in the sky, it's pretty dusk. It's not totally blackout yet, but it's getting dark. And my brother and I were never afraid of walking back to the house at night, since we knew this part from the hill back to our house pretty well, and we were pretty hardy teenagers. We just kept thinking, there's no way somebody's back here. I mean, the only way to access it is you'd have to go all the way around, maybe another 40 or so acres in either direction. And quite frankly, if somebody was out here, they would have a lantern or some sort of flashlight. And there's really nothing out here. It's not hunting season. There's nothing of value. There's no reason why anybody should be back here. And the other thing is this movement sounded like it was coming from something very large, much bigger than just a man. All these thoughts are going through my head, and I'm sure my brother's at the same time. And we're looking, and we're looking. And then, my brother and I at the same time in unison see these red glowing eyes just appear down in the bottom of the hill, and they're moving up towards us. I believe again, my brother sees it first, and he hits me on the shoulder, and he says, "Look," and points. and we both see it. This figure, this tall figure is coming towards us with red eyes. I remember saying, "What is that?" And it gets closer and closer. And I think at this point, we were both so scared we couldn't even get up to move. I know the natural instinct is to probably get up and run. But when you're that terrified, on a primal fear level, it's different. It grounds you in a way that you can't physically react like you're supposed to. It got closer and closer till the shadows and darkness of the tree coverage became lighter and lighter, and we could start to make out what it was. It's almost like the lack of darkness allowed this thing to be illuminated by whatever little light there was supplied by the stars and the moon. My brother and I got a front row show to the horror of whatever this creature was that certainly was far from anything human. And after seeing it with my own eyes, which I later verified with my brother in verbatim to make sure we saw the same thing, this looked like some sort of lizard alien thing. I'm not sure what else you'd call it, to be honest. But I can tell you, it had a flat face, slitted pupils, large red-yellow eyes, a very reptilian-shaped like head. It was very tall, not really built strong, full of muscles, like you would see in a bodybuilder, but more so very lanky in its torso and its arms and legs. And it had this large tail behind it. It was kind of like a large lizard man, I guess, if that's the best way to describe it. It never opened up its mouth, so I never saw any teeth. But I could tell that its face, like I said, was flat, and the nose had slits. It also never made any sounds, other than the crunching of leaves and coming up from the brush. It was maybe, 50 feet away from us, when my brother manages to jump up, grab me by the collar, and yank me and pull me. Somehow, like kick-starting a motor, that's all my legs needed in order to run back to the house. And at this point, it was dark. Maybe not pitch black, but darker. And the second we go running down the hill, back towards the slope up to our property, we can hear this thing now picking up its pace, chasing us, running behind us, and it's gaining quickly. Trust me, I did not look back. I know all about that. I was not going to risk that happen, and falling and tripping over a rock, and just being bait for whatever this thing was. Again, it never screamed or let any noise, just that it gave chase. We made it to the bottom of this hill, and the gradual slope back up to our house. I think it must have stopped either way, somewhere along before we hit the bottom, because afterwards, we didn't see it anymore, or hear it, and I really have no idea what it was. We'd made it back, just in time. Our parents weren't home, and so I didn't want to tell them anything anyway. I talked to my brother, asked him, "What do you think that was?" Because we both saw the same thing. We're not crazy. We didn't just see stuff. We did not hallucinate. That thing was as real as flesh and blood can get. And it's safe to say we didn't sleep that much that night. As terrified as I was from the whole experience, I tried to think analytically. Like, okay, this is obviously some sort of large predatory animal, bipedal or not. Then I start thinking about the logistics. Well, there's a lot of food back there. Tons of deer, tons of bear and foxes, lots of food, lots of places to go undisturbed and hide. If there's anywhere there would be some sort of creature like this, that backside of the property is exactly where you would find one. Although, I'm sure that my father has maybe had sightings himself, but he would never tell us, I'm sure. We had gone back there since multiple times, and yes, even at dusk, but we never saw this thing again. You might call me either brave or stupid for going back there, especially at dark. But, when you're a teenager, you think you're practically invincible, as we did. We felt that if we had a Bowie knife and the proper tools, we would be more equipped to handle a situation like that, which we kept on us all the time from that point forward, but never encountered it again, whatever it was. Let me just say this first and foremost. I'm not a conspiracy person. I don't own a tinfoil hat, metaphorically, of course, and I'm a pretty rational, scientific-rooted person. But I have no way to explain away this experience that I had back in 1998. Let me tell you, I was just a sophomore in college, and I was working in a bar in a small town in southwestern Florida. It was a great place, frequented by locals, many of whom I knew and many of whom knew me. We had a lot of regular faces. It was a place where people could get beer and never have to worry about somebody making them feel uncomfortable or getting hit on or getting in a fight. At least, not while on my shifts. It was a fun place. At the time, I was the only girl working there. I was the bartender and the only female that served beer. So, I was the only female that had to work at the bar. The place was a small old building that had originally been a gas station, and years later was converted to the store, and then eventually became a bar. The bar was in the front, and the back of the building held the kitchen, a small office, and the bathrooms. So, enough about that. It was a Saturday night. I was working the bar all by myself, which I was accustomed to. I had worked by myself quite a bit, and I'm not gonna lie, I have never made as great as tips as I ever have in my life working that job. But tonight was pretty slow. The place only had a few customers, and I was chatting with a group of maybe 3 people who were sitting there at the bar. Just small talk, just joking around and having fun. I thought I was having a pretty good time until this particular man walked in. He walks up right to the bar and I turn around, cleaning a bar mug. I did not know this man. I'd never seen him before, but there was something interesting about what he wore and the way he looked. I did not know anybody else who knew him. In fact, I wasn't the only one startled by his presence. Everybody in that bar seemed to kind of have that Hollywood movie moment where the guy walks in and where everybody just stops and kind of stares with a blank expression. That's the perfect way to kind of captivate this moment. He sits down, never breaking a stare. I mean, he's a big guy, strong jawline, dark hair. He had a black shirt on and jeans and looked like he had just come from the gym. The thing that struck me the most, though, was his eyes. They were these incredibly dark eyes. Not like fully black or anything, but he just had really stark, contrasty eyes. They were almost hypnotizing, and not in a lustful, romantic way. It was almost like a trance, like he had this power. I know, it's a bizarre description, but that's what it was. He had this very intense look on his face, almost like he was waiting for somebody, me, to say something. So I kind of stood there without a word, just staring back at him, wondering who this guy was. After a little bit, maybe 10 seconds, I nervously just said, "Can I help you?" without him ever breaking his gaze. He just kept stare, smirked a little, and just said, "I think so." Now at this point, I was getting creeped out. His demeanor, his attitude, everything was just weird. I mean, I've worked here already for a while, and no guy has ever just came in here and looked at me like that, without saying anything. I didn't know what he wanted, and I did not know who he was. So, my response was, okay, what do you want?" He paused for a moment. Keep in mind, during this entire interaction, I don't even think I saw the man blink once, let alone break eye contact. It was the creepiest thing. He calmly just says, "I want you," in a very monotone. At this point, not only am I creeped out, but I'm confused. And in the moment and being nervous, I was like, I'm working, what do you want?" He smirked again and said, "I would like to buy you a drink, if you want one." I had to politely kind of shoot him down and say, "Well, I'm working, so I don't drink right now. But maybe if you stick around, you can buy me one later." So he said, "Okay." And he just sat there, looking at the menu. And so now I'm kicking myself for even saying that. Stupid, stupid. Why did I give him such an invitation? Oh gosh, I was a nervous wreck. The people sitting at the bar just kept staring back at me, staring back at him, staring at each other, exchanging glances of confusement and, oh boy, she's in trouble kind of look. He sat there quiet, and I was busy cleaning and doing my job duties. Maybe 45 minutes goes by and he's still sitting there, staring at the menu. I think I asked him, "Have you thought about what you wanted yet?" And as he turns to look back up at me, here's the terrifying part. As he lifts his head up in response to my question, his eyes were not normal. There was something wrong with them. They looked like snake eyes or something. They were this dark green and had these huge black slits in them. And maybe like a half second later, no more than a second, it's almost like they turned normal again. Like the same way an alligator does. You know, how they have those secondary eyelids. It was like a blinking, but not with his actual eyelids. I kind of screamed when I saw it, and kind of flung myself back. He did that blinking thing and his eyes were normal again, just very dark. And he looked puzzled, but still very mono-expressive. Tilted his head very robotically and asked, "What's wrong?" I told him, "You need to get out of here now, or I'm calling the police." Then, without ever breaking eye contact, he slowly stands up, then turns his head and his body, and slowly goes to walk out the door. As he gets to the door, he stops as his hand touches the door, turns around, looks at me again, and says, "It's a shame. You would have made such a great addition." Then immediately turned around and walked out. That was the last I ever saw of him. My skin felt like it was crawling. I was so creeped out. The guys at the bar were like, "Who was that guy?" And I told them, "I don't know." Luckily, my regulars were very kind and nice to me and said, "Hey, we don't know who he was, but we all got the creeps. We'll stay here late if you'd like to close to protect you." I thought that was very kind, and I took all three guys up on the offer. And they stayed with me until my shift ended at around 1 or 2 in the morning, kept me company. The guy never reappeared. So that's my college story. Now, here's an important note. Fast forward almost 10 years to about 2009, and my aunt is very big, still is by the way, into the paranormal and things like conspiracy theories, reptilians, all that kind of stuff. Nothing that I really ever pay attention to. But I guess she was telling me there are these beings called reptilians. They apparently have the ability to shapeshift into people. I kind of laughed the notion off at first, and then she went on to show me some clips. People being caught on camera, like newscasters and TV hosts and celebrities, except their eyes change, and she showed me that. I felt my skin crawl again. That memory of that night instantly came back to me. That's exactly what I saw that night. I didn't tell my aunt anything. I mean, I always thought she was kind of crazy, but I just kind of shot her down and was like, "Yeah, that's terrifying." But I knew deep down, something was wrong with that man. I can't sit here and say with concrete evidence that was exactly the case, but the resemblance to the video she showed me, to what his eyes looked like and his strange odd behavior, sure is uncanny how close they're related. I'm originally born in California, and me and my family stayed there till I was about 9 or so years old. Then, we moved out to West Virginia for my dad's work, and we stayed there for about 4 years. And then finally, we moved to upstate New York, and that's where I still am now. I'm 23 right now, but that's besides the point. I'm just trying to give you some sort of time reference to the story that I'm going to tell you. Because when we moved to West Virginia, and I was there for about 4 or 5 years, the area of the back of our house was a thick, boggy marsh, and that is where my story takes place. I can't sit here and say that I saw any swamp monsters, or that I saw the creature from the Black Lagoon, but what I can say is that due to my explorative nature, I was in that boggy marsh multiple times, never had an issue, But then there were some times where I would get strange feelings, like I was being followed, or that something was hunting me. I say hunting because it's the same feeling you get when somebody is out to get you and you know it. Even though I would check my surroundings constantly, there are certain areas where the brush is so thick you can't exactly see more than 5 or 10 feet in front of you. So somebody or something could easily be on the other side of the brush, and you would never know it unless you went through it. But unless you have the proper equipment or gear, making it through the brush and wading through can be very difficult, depending on the season. While this feeling had come over me multiple times, I never actually saw anything until more recently, before we moved. It was probably a year or so before we moved. And keep in mind, since we had moved, I had been exploring this marshy bog for quite some time. Not every day, and certainly not every season, but I would try and make it an often occurrence to go out there, get my boots on, and go exploring. Even though I'd been followed, or what I assumed been followed for quite some time before, this particular event, just one time, I saw what I can only describe as large human-like shadows or figures coming at me from the bog. It's not like a horror movie, where you look out into the fog and you see these large black figures coming towards you. I just saw them in the brush, watching me, and it was too dark to make out any features, but I could see them moving, wading through the thick water behind broken trees and stuff. That was enough for me, because I could easily tell from their sheer size alone, in accordance to other things around them that I knew very well. These were far larger than any standard man that I would see, and being a 13, 14-year-old boy at the time was incredibly frightening, considering the only weapon I kept on me at the time was a miniature pocket knife. I mainly just kept that for, well, I claimed self-defense, but who are we kidding? I probably couldn't even taken down a dog with that thing. Anyway, I stopped playing in the marsh after that, and shortly after, within the year, we ended up moving up to New York. Now, I don't deal with any of that stuff, but it's still a very vivid memory from my childhood, or from my early teenagehood. Do I believe in monsters? No. Do I believe in Bigfoot? No. But I cannot deny that there was definitely something out there in the marsh that didn't want me out there. What it was exactly, I'm not sure, but I am nearly certain it was not a human being. Many, many, many years ago, I used to live outside a very small suburb in Orlando, Florida. Years back before Orlando became the modern booming town and city that it currently is right now. This story predates the 2000s, so this also means that the suburb I was living had a lot more Everglades around, and a lot less people, which means more wildlife, and just overall a better, simpler time. This particular time, I was driving home from a friend's house when I stopped in the middle of the road because I began hearing strange noises, not from behind my car or in front of it, but to the sides of it. I stopped, rolled down my window, and listened. Off in the Everglades, if I had to guess, 50 to 100 feet, but it's hard to accurately tell, just due to the way the Everglades are. A very loud, screaming, roaring sound. It's hard for me to pinpoint exactly how to describe it. It was like a screaming, kind of like a woman, but much, much lower in pitch, and had this deep, deep bass to it, that every time it would scream, I could feel the rumble through my body in my car. It immediately freaked me out, because I feel like I know the Everglades somewhat, and there's no known animal that makes that sound. I know cougars make a screaming noise, but I also know that it sounds nothing like what I heard then. So I continued to sit and listen, and I could tell it wasn't too far away. It just kept screaming and screaming, and no preferred pattern. It was all random lengths of time and duration, and then it just suddenly stopped. I took that as a good sign and good time to pull on the gas and get out of there, go back home, rest. What that was to this day, I'm not exactly sure. I've heard other weird stories about the skunk ape and other bizarre things in the Everglades, supposed swamp monsters and other things, but I never really bought into any of that. I've never seen a skunk ape myself, nor do I believe in the whole Bigfoot phenomenon, but I can't dismiss the noises that I heard that night. Now, do those noises belong to the skunk ape? I don't think so, but then again, I don't know. But I can tell you I've never heard an animal make that noise before, especially with the volume and bass that it had to that roar, scream, whatever you want to call it. Whatever it was had to have been of considerable size to have that kind of lung power. That's all I can really say. I don't know if this was a Bigfoot or what this was, but I keep my mind open because it was something out there, and I know for a fact it came from the swamp, because it circled around our tent at the time, sniffed and made some grunting noises, and then walked back off. So, let me set this story for you. Back when I was a kid, we would regularly go visit my cousins who lived in Georgia at the time. We lived up in Washington State, where I would stay for the rest of the year. But every July or August, we would make a 2-week vacation down there in either month. And if you know anything about Georgia, it's thick with humidity and swamps everywhere. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, or any other area of the country that doesn't deal with excruciating amounts of humidity, well, you basically just die for the entire time you're there. And since I wasn't acclimated, that's pretty much what I did, which resulted in my cousins always making fun of me. They were much more outdoorsy than I am, and still are to this day, but I do enjoy outdoor recreational activities. Although I'm not a hunter or a fisher by any means, I do enjoy camping and hiking. I can't exactly remember what year this was, but I can tell you I was somewhere around 12 or 13, and my cousins were 15 and 16. So, we were at their house, and my cousins have very, very large property. Surrounding their entire property is acres. I want to say easily 20 to 30 of just thick swamp on all 3 sides of their house, followed by a long road that goes out. I know it can be kind of dangerous because they said they had alligators in there before, so we never did really any much swamp exploration like I had wanted to. I mean, we had gone in there a few times, but never truly in depth. So, this night, we were camping out in their backyard or on their property. From where we were in our tent, we could see the house. It was maybe a 2 or 3 minute walk, but far enough away that we felt like we were actually camping out in nature. We had a pretty large tent too. I think it was my cousin's 10-man tent. Well, we were sitting there talking with the lantern on, and that's when we began hearing brush and branches breaking from off in the swamp, coming in our direction. We were all looking at each other, wondering, what is that? My cousin, hesitating, and then quickly turning off the lantern, making it pitch dark. Then we just listened. Something very big, and I describe big because each footstep that it made shook the ground. What's disturbing was that it wasn't 4 steps, it was 2. Pum-pum, 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 in that pattern. It just came closer and closer to our tent, where finally, it appeared to be no more than 5 or 10 feet away, circled our tent completely, stopped, and then walked back into the swamp in a near opposite direction of which it came from. During that time, as it got close to our tent, we could hear whatever it was breathing, and it sounded like they were very strained breaths. Imagine somebody who smokes about a couple packs of cigarettes a day. It was very, very raspy and very deep in breath. Whatever it was sounded like it had huge lungs, and it came from a very large animal. Although I can't for the life of me think of any large animal that comes out of the swamp at night that walks on 2 legs. And at some point, right before it stopped to head off in the opposite direction to another area of swamp, It kind of grunted, like you do when somebody tells you or scolds you, and you kind of do a that kind of grunt. I don't know what that was about, but my cousins and I were absolutely terrified. As soon as it left and we couldn't hear it anymore, we just grabbed the lantern and we fled back to the house, telling our families that something was out there, and we were all pretty spooked. But of course, all of our parents tried to calm us down and tell us nothing is out there. There's no such thing as swamp monsters. We didn't think it was a swamp monster, but we knew it was something that wasn't a person or any sort of animal that we knew of. It was enough that we just slept on the living room couch, and then in the morning time, we went and retreated our tent. Come morning time, we went outside to go and take our tent down, gather up all of our things like our sleeping bag, and whatever it is else we had in the tent at the time. We made our way out there, and we looked around the tent, and that's when we saw these massive footprints in the soft soil, or should I say soft muck, considering much of the area around this tent was grass mixed with very, very soft mud. These were massive prints, but indented enough that you couldn't really make them out unless you stood right above them. I couldn't really discern the foot. You could see that there was a large shape indented into the ground, but it wasn't like a supposed Bigfoot cast to where you could see definitive toes and a clear outline. This was just indented enough to where you could tell that something very heavy stood there or walked there. And we tried to follow the tracks and can see that it was indeed a bipedal pattern, and it did walk exactly around our tent, just as we had heard the night prior. We called both of our parents out and had them look at it. They were puzzled and believed us, but they even themselves weren't really sure what to make of it. I think all in all, they just ended up writing it off as who knows what, and that was the end of that. Now that I'm an adult, I'm pretty sure they did that to not scare us any further than we already were. But time has gone on now, and I'm in my 30s now. Both my cousins serve in the military, and I work full-time as a designer, so there's really no time for outdoor camping, tenting, or swamp exploring. Anyway, that's my horror story from the swamps, from back when I was just a kid. Enjoy. My dad and I were coming back from a family reunion in Tennessee, and we decided to go to some places that had made him the happiest as a child. Seeing as how our family had moved from that area before, he was far old enough to really remember them. We arrived at one specific location, and we noticed a famous stream that he would always talk about as a kid that he loved to go and fish at, play, and just be a kid, had been replaced by a small highway. So we drove around a little while longer, searching for other areas. We found another good one, a little place that he liked to hang out as a teenager. This area was now full of discarded cans and garbage. It wasn't all that great. As we're kind of looking around this area, further back, there were trails that he would usually hike down, and being a teenager, was full of debauchery. He's motioning for me to continue down this trail that led just a little bit deeper into the woods. Now, keep in mind, at this point, a lot of the surrounding wilderness had been turned to highway, and much of the surrounding swamps were now being used for development, not like they were back in the 80s. Now, the surrounding woods we were entering were very thick, very dense. It even kind of cut off light the further in you went. And, I don't know exactly what it was at first. I guess I kind of just got a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. Not anything specific, like what you tell in your stories where people get the feeling that they were being watched. Nothing like that. It was more just a gut instinct, like it's probably not safe to continue on further. In that moment, I assumed it was maybe because there might be dangerous homeless people around, or drug addicts, or what have you, since there did seem to be signs of homeless camps, what with all the garbage and cans and stuff, or worse. Now, out of the blue, my father stops dead in his tracks, sticks out his arm as if to stop me from walking further, and I look up at him. and he's staring right at something, and he has the most serious expression on his face. So I'm asking him, "Dad, what do you see? What's up?" And I look out to where he's looking. Well, directly in front of us was kind of this little marsh, I guess you can call it. There was a cement wall on the other side that led to a lone road. Well, on this concrete block, or concrete wall, I guess you can call it, was a medium-sized storm drain. And out of the storm drain was climbing this, what I will describe to you as a lizard man. I feel silly for even typing that, but that's the only way how I know how to describe it. I mean, imagine a person in a lizard costume or something. Except the movements were so smooth that there's no way this would be somebody in a costume. All the way out here, it didn't really make any sense. We weren't exactly miles and miles out from town, but we also weren't in the middle of a metropolitan area either. And who in their right mind would be climbing out of a storm drain in that sort of costume? We saw it kind of climb its way out and climb down into the marsh. Luckily, we were kind of tucked away back in the trees enough where this creature or animal did not seem to notice us, but my father and I got a very good look at it. Honestly, it kind of reminded me of like a half-man, half-dinosaur sort of thing. The head was very much so reptilian-like. The body was covered in scales, and it had a man very much like a body. 2 arms, a chest, body, legs, all that stuff. Which is why I made the lizard man costume reference a paragraph ago. Once it climbed down out of the storm drain, it began walking off in the opposite direction, into the thick tree line where there's more dense, thicker swamps. It never turned to look in our direction and never seemed to have noticed us. My dad, of course, his gaze was locked on this thing for the whole 20-30 seconds that we watched it disappear. I think him and I were in such shock and awe, but more so him. I kind of couldn't believe my eyes, but he seemed to have this look on his face that just screamed danger. After this thing disappeared into the thicket of the trees, he finally broke his gaze and looked at me and just said, "We should leave, now." You know, I wasn't going to challenge that. I didn't ask any questions, so we quickly headed on back up the trail, maybe no more than a half a mile, up to the original spot that had all those discarded cans and garbage, made our way back further, and got to the car. After some time, I was the one to finally break the silence and ask, "Dad, what did we see out there? I mean, we both saw it, right? Is that some sort of unidentified animal or maybe undiscovered species?" He remained quiet and just looked at me with a very cold stare and said, "I don't know, son, but I didn't like it." I mean, I know it's a very anticlimactic ending to my encounter, but that's really all that was said. And my father and I have not talked about it since. I mean, I don't really see much of a reason to, but I thought in recent events with the world, I would maybe try and find some time, now that I had off, to reach out to different paranormal investigators and even story narrators, which is why I'm kind of drawn to your work and your channel. So I thought I would shoot you an email. And hey, worst comes to worst, I don't get a response. And best comes to best, you read my story and your audience can help me out, since it appears they've helped out so many others. Best of luck and thank you so much. It was my son and I, and a friend. We were out trout fishing at a local lake, not too far away from home base. It was a late summer evening, around maybe 9:30, just enough to where it was getting pretty dusky, but not quite dark yet. We were all sitting at the end of a dock fishing, and we had our dog, Jody, with us. He's a sweet boy, a Labrador retriever. We take him on all of our outings. At least we like to think he keeps us safe. He barks whenever there's a predator around, so he does a pretty good job of warning us and warding off any potential danger. And thanks to him, with this encounter, we saw what we did and potentially saved our lives. We're sitting there with our lines in the water, lost in conversation, and we hear Jody start barking and barking at something. I turn my attention, and I see he's barking at the water, off to our left. Then, I look a little closer, and I see the shape of something large coming up out of the lake. I motion to my friend and my son, and they all look in unison, and we're watching as Jody now begins to bark frantically, going crazy. And then, out of the lake, steps this horror. I don't even know how to describe it accurately in detail. It kind of reminded me of a half-man, half-alligator. Really ugly and grotesque looking, covered in scales and that thick armor plate that alligators are known for having. It just kind of ascends up out of the water. This elongated face. It turns and looks at us, stares at Jody, and casually walks off into the thicket that's right there, maybe no more than 10 feet from the water. As soon as it fully ascends out of the water and onto the shore, Jody begins whimpering and running back towards us, as he's terrified of whatever creature that is. My son, nearly soiling himself, was screaming, "Dad, Dad, what is that? What did we just see?" And my friend, of course, was silent, as was I. We couldn't really say much, but we all three agreed in unison, "Let's leave." I just didn't feel it was safe there anymore. On the drive back, we all kind of talked about it a little more and said, "Man, I don't know what that thing was, but as soon as we saw it, this feeling of we should leave now, it's not safe, just kind of took over all of us. I mean, had it not, I don't think we would have left. Something was wrong. What that something was, I don't know. Look, I am not an advocate for the strange and paranormal. I don't believe in ghosts or any of that, or even Bigfoot or strange creatures. But I can't explain this animal. I don't want to go so far as to say it was a lake monster. I feel like that's ridiculous, but I've never seen a reptilian that was bipedal, that also came out of the lake. That was a first for all of us." I don't quite know how to say this, so I'm just going to come out and say it. I saw something the other day in the swamp that just confused the utter dickens out of me. There are two reasons that I like to go to the swamps. One, because I like to row down it and enjoy nature as it is supposed to be. Two, is because I am part of a neighborhood watch. I'm not sure what to call it, but I basically go out and look for animals that are in danger and try to keep some animals away from poachers if I can. On one of my trips out, I noticed something lying in the way off the side of the river that looked like it may have been injured. It was laying on its side, and it was partially on the bank and partially in the water. I thought it might have been killed by something, or it was injured from something. I rowed off to the side of it and got out of my boat. I grabbed my snare pole out of the back and used the handle end to nudge the animal to see if it might have been resting. But it didn't move. Now that I was closer, it looked like it was a young crocodile, maybe only 5 months old. Well, the weird thing is, down here in America, we don't have crocodiles. We have alligators. So this looked very weird to me. I got my snare around where I thought its head would be, and I pulled it out of the water so it could breathe. When I saw that it wasn't an alligator or a crocodile, I don't know if I can describe it quite right, but it looked like a dog. Like a crocodile dog. I know that sounds weird, but that's what it looked like. It had the ears of the dog, the eyes of a dog, and a snout that quite resembled more of a crocodilian-looking thing. Except it had the trademark teeth of a crocodile. It was hideous looking. I also noticed that it had huge claws, and it had a mixture of fur and scales. What the hell? I thought. Was this some sort of science experiment gone wrong? Its body was green, but again, it looked and kind of resembled a dog. A very thick-skinned kind of animal. It was very hideous. Its mouth was hanging open too, like if it was panting. I took the snare off it and climbed back into the boat. I grabbed a beef jerky stick out of my backpack and opened it I stayed in the boat, but I threw it towards the thing to see if the smell of meat would wake it up. I saw its nose twitching from the smell. It moved its head sideways to eat it. Whatever it was still very weak and small and frail, but I didn't know why. I grabbed my water and got back out of the boat. I slowly poured the water near it so it could drink. Normally, I think I should be terrified by whatever this thing was, but it was injured and in a state that was almost near death. I checked its body for any kind of wound, and I saw that it had a gunshot on its side. It was then that this creature, whatever it was, began to act very aggressive towards me, and almost coming back to life the closer I got to it. It started snapping at me and getting very lively all of a sudden. Maybe it was best that I step back into my boat, I thought, and so I did. And this thing started to become much more aggressive and hostile in nature, almost beginning to gain its strength back in a sort of second. That's when it started to try and stand up on two legs. Even though this thing was tiny, frail, and clearly hurt or injured, it didn't like that I was trying to help it. Even though I didn't care that this thing looked like a failed science experiment, it was in my inner best heart that I wanted to see this thing brought back to health, no matter how hideous it was or unnatural it was. Again, I've never seen a creature like this before, but the second it started acting aggressive and trying to attack me with as little strength as it had, that's when I realized I should get out of there, and so I did. As I'm kind of pulling away, this thing seemed to regain its strength so fast, and finally pursued me by jumping back in the water, swimming towards me. Listen, I know this sounds crazy and all, and normally I would tell you you're crazy if it did. This thing only seemed to pursue me for a little while after I got on my boat, and then disappeared underneath the water for good. I still think about it because this wasn't that long ago, and it was very weird. I've talked to some of my friends about it, and other people who are in my Animal Neighborhood Watch group, and nobody seems to know exactly what I'm talking about, or they think I'm making up the story. Anyway, believe me if you will, but this is my true sighting of something I would consider strange and unknown, and possibly paranormal. The only thing I don't quite understand is why it was so frail and weak and floating under the water, half on the shore, like it was yanked out of somewhere and thrown on its side, left to die, and then shot. Maybe it was stunned. Again, I don't really know. I'm just trying to get answers for all these questions that I have. Who really knows? Is it possible that this really was a science experiment and was pulled out here in the swamps and shot, left to die, because it was a failed creation? That is something that haunts me, still to this day. I'm posting this under a fake name and account, so it can't be traced. I know that probably sounds paranoid, but I just want to make sure. This needs to get out there so people can begin finding out about this creature that was so wrongfully made. It appears that you're well aware of dogman and many of the other cryptids that exist. Well, about 4 years ago, I can tell you all more about the genetic experiments that began on hybrid creatures. These kinds of things have been going on for a very long time, so it's probably no surprise to you and people who are in that circle of knowledge. Things like this were fully field tested and were deemed to be ready, but something in the development stages went wrong. A specific breed of creatures that were part canine, part crocodilian. Some people on the team call them croc dogs, and I guess that is what they're called now. I don't know if there are many other sightings of these things, because they're relatively new development, but it is what it is. These creatures were designed to be super soldiers, to be used in upcoming and future wars. They were constructed and pulled from the DNA of Nile crocodiles and multiple species of canine, like German Shepherd, Retrievers, and Huskies. We thought that if we could make a chimera-like creature, along with the many others, it would have all the best abilities of both, the discipline of a canine, and would be a perfect companion and use an enemy for troops. They could have them breach and clear whole buildings of dangerous enemies. At first, The thought that it would have specific traits, scales and thick skin, and a canine's discipline and duty. During the testing stages, there were great results. In open combat simulations, they performed amazing. Their handlers were able to train them, just like they had trained any other disciplined animal. These were truly meant to be killing machines. But we did have to change some training scenarios. I don't know if you'd call them pups, but we'll refer to them as that, the younglings, of course. They would hunt down a target and subdue them. And our testing coordinator was bitten, and it didn't end well. The ferocity of these creatures was unmatched. They were extremely dangerous and hostile, one of which we actually had to pull down the power of their bite because it was too immensely powerful. Eventually, the project was discontinued when these things were getting older, and they became far too intelligent, possessing almost a human-like strategic intelligence, and began attacking their handlers. During other combat simulations, some of them were trying to help. Not all were a problem, but they became one. They had broken out and became too much to handle. Not long after things began to go south with the project, our coordinator was told by another unofficial branch of government who oversaw the entire project, was told to basically pull the plug. So many of our small branch of these creations were put down, so to speak. However, some made it out. I'm only writing this today because I found out one of them is in the wild, and I need to know that people need to be careful. I live in Georgia, just north of a testing facility that exists that many people probably don't know about, and I know a few of them are out roaming around. Again, these things aren't very old. They're just within the past few years. And I want you to know that these kind of chimera creations are existing all over the world. Some are getting out. Some are purposefully being let out. I feel incredible guilt over having a part to play in the design and creation and being a part of this project. Listen, I understand that sending this to you probably comes off as a creepypasta because there are so many that claim to have a story like I do, but are actually fictitious horror stories. Well, I'm here to tell you that this is my own horror story, and that these things are actually going on. So it's really up to you. You can believe it or not, but I'm telling you what I was a part of, and the creation that I helped make. I can't guarantee you how many of these things are actually out there, just like Bigfoot or dogman. There's an undisclosed number, but just like their cryptid counterparts, they are highly intelligent, very hostile and aggressive, and masters of hiding and camouflage, especially in their swamp environment. Call me crazy, but I could have sworn, a month ago, me and my girlfriend, while walking on a dike, saw this strange reptile-like creature, hunched over, crawling out of the storm drain, right near our house. My girlfriend and I like to take hikes on the dike often, since it runs several miles, all up and down the river, and to our left is a large storm drain opening. The only people that ever go down there is other teenagers, people who do drugs, and maybe graffiti. There's really no point in going in there. It's just that, a large empty storm drain tunnel that leads out to the small river. As we were walking by, somewhere I think around April 4th or 5th, we're just walking and having conversation. She looks over and it's like, "Hey, look, check that out, Braden." I turn and see this thing that's all white, but kind of like a pale green, crawling on all fours out of the storm drain, like it's struggling to move. Then it just kind of plops down and quickly scurries off into the brush. My girlfriend and I were both like, what did we just see? I'll try and describe it to you as best as I can, because it was daylight. Even though a little bit of overcast, we still got a pretty good look at it, and even saw its face. Its skin, though, was hands down the weirdest looking. It kind of reminded me of a large blanket draped over its skin that hugged tightly. Like its skin was all interconnected. There wasn't a distinct arm and leg. It was all like webbed together, if that makes any sense. And it had these dull kind of white spines protruding out of its back. I don't even know if they were poking out of its skin, but they were bony and lumpy. The head was just like a person's, but it had these little nubby bumps all over its skull. It was more green on the head, and it had scales from what it appeared. The face was flat, the eyes being very big, sunken in, and what appeared to be yellow. I couldn't see a mouth, but I can tell you it did not have a snout, so I didn't see any lips, or a nose really, not at the distance we were. It even had a tail too, that was very similar to like an alligator's tail, except not as spiny. The whole experience, whatever we were looking at, was freaky looking. It kind of reminded me of something you'd see off Star Trek, like some reptilian alien race or something. I don't know. My girlfriend isn't really into sci-fi movies like I am, so to her, it just freaked her right out. She always refers to it now as a failed science experiment, or some sort of creature that broke loose from a lab and escaped in the storm drain. Oh, and the size of this thing. It was easily the size of an adult, which is one of the reasons why we were so freaked out. And it moved so awkwardly, like it wasn't comfortable moving in the position and the body that it was placed in. It was not fluid and smooth at all, like it had stiff joints or something. I don't know. Even just thinking back to it creeps me out. What surprises me too is we were maybe only 40 feet away from it, and we had a clear view of it. Had it looked up, it would have looked up directly at us, even though we got a pretty good look at its face, its body, everything, and it just quickly wanted to scurry off and hide, as if it knew it was vulnerable and exposed. Me and my girlfriend have since walked that dike and have not seen it again since. And now, sometimes, we'll kind of dare each other to go down to the storm drain to see if there are more of them, or that thing is back there. Anyway, talk about a strange experience. It was at nighttime, and I was driving along Highway 24, right around the area of this old mill house. This is when I stopped at a stop sign, and I see something large coming out of the tall field grass. At first, I assumed it was maybe a deer, but then I saw it was clearly no deer. The creature I saw, well, I can't identify it. I can tell you this, though. It was a behemoth of a thing. Maybe 800 pounds, and I'm not exaggerating. And its body was large and very serpentine-like, or snake-like, I should say. The head alone was maybe 2 or 3 feet large. Yeah, I'm not kidding you. This thing was massive. And it just seemed to kind of rise up out of the grass so calmly. It got about 10 feet away from my car and just glanced on by, as if me being there wasn't a big deal at all. In fact, it really didn't pay any attention to me. Like, it could have cared less that I even saw this thing. And as you can imagine, seeing something like this for the first time, especially at night, feeling extremely vulnerable, having no weapons, nothing, I was terrified out of my mind. This giant human reptile thing walking around with 2 red eyes. Part of me wanted to just stick in my disbelief. This creature checked off every box in a horror movie cliche. But at the same time, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. Its gait, its movement. You could see its muscles and skin. Either this was somebody in the most convincing Hollywood monster costume I have ever seen and that's ever been made, or this was something truly out of this world. What's your opinion? This story takes place back in 2014. I was in a 2-story house with my brother, kind of out in the backwoods of Missouri. He and his band rented this house out collectively for rehearsal. It wasn't an out of town too far, but you had to drive maybe about 10-15 minutes to get to it. And being a good brother that he is, allowed me to stay in the upper 2-story part, which is just one big open room, which I used for my bedroom for a couple of weeks after getting out of a very toxic relationship. So, very early on in the morning, I'd say 3 or 4, I was having trouble sleeping, and I'm out there on the balcony, looking down, just at the woods and the surrounding area, lost in thought. And I suddenly see a huge, maybe 6-7 foot tall dark figure darting across the tree line. It caught my attention, and I thought it was an animal at first, until I looked. That's when I could see the figure much more clearly, because it moved. What I was looking at was a large bipedal animal, and believe it or not, it kind of resembled a cross between a gorilla, a lizard, and a human. Although I couldn't see every enunciation of detail. It was very dark in color. Not just its coloring, but the lighting as well. Its head was huge. It had big long arms, and its body was also large too. The head, though, was more elongated, and, like I stated, easily 6 to 7 feet tall. The only reason that I even saw this thing was because it was a full moon that night. But where the moon was positioned and angled in the sky did not, unfortunately, light up this thing so I can get a look at it. It was in fact on the other area of the sky, giving just enough light that I could see something was here, but not all the details that I wanted. I know it might sound kind of morbid, but I was kind of wanting to see what this thing looked like. Only because it was so unique, I guess. It stood there in the tree line for maybe, 10-15 seconds, and then it kind of disappeared deeper into the woods. I was the only person at the house at the time, and I actually wasn't that creeped out. While it was slightly disturbing, I kind of just wrote it off as maybe the darkness playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe the stress and emotional baggage from the bad relationship was causing me to see things that weren't exactly there. I slept on it, and after getting up the next morning, I realized last night was indeed not just stress, but I actually saw something. I've always been a believer in monsters and animals we might not be able to explain, and I've even seen some strange things in my life. But this, my friend, was definitely the strangest I had hands down ever seen. I've endured some pretty wild experiences while I lived with my father just outside of Waco, Texas, from the age of 15 to 20. Man, I got so many stories I could share with you, so I'll start with one. This would have been in the summertime of 2013. My father was busy setting up his gun range of the far back side of the house. He had a bunch of old tires he was building a gun wall and setting up a really nice range. During this, he said he felt a strange feeling. A feeling of imminent danger, like he shouldn't be there. He thought the entire thing was strange and fought off his gut instinct as much as possible. After all, this was our property. We've had no problems with intruders ever before. And now this? So, ignoring it and quelching any emotion, my father continued pulling old tires out of the back of the pickup, setting up the gun range, and he sees this figure, a blur, go right by him. He quickly turns in reaction and sees this large green figure on all fours, off in the trees, and as soon as he laid eyes on it, it looks over at him, and they make direct eye contact. He said that he felt that this thing was intelligent, just by looking at it. It wasn't just some giant oversized lizard. It was of incredible size anyway, though, and so he quickly put his hand on his Glock and got ready, just in case this thing decided to make a move and act aggressive. And as soon as my father put his hand on his Glock, and this thing watching him the entire time, grabs hold of the nearby tree and stands up on 2 legs. It grabbed hold of the tree, like it needed the support to pull itself up, which my dad always noted it was very strange to see that. From there, it appeared as if the stare down between my father and this thing deepened in intensity. This thing slowly opened its mouth, revealing a loud but deep guttural hiss. And it was in that moment that my father felt imminent fear and danger. So he readied his pistol, taking aim, but not firing yet. But he felt that this thing was getting ready to attack. Just by the look in its eyes, he told me, "Son, when you see this specific look in a wild animal's eyes, you just know they're getting ready to attack." And that's exactly what he claims he saw. So he pulls back the hammer, and this thing immediately
begins charging at him on two legs, with its arms outstretched and kind of dangling. He fires 3 quick shots. Bam, bam, bam! And whatever this thing was, immediately stops, drops down to all fours, turns to the side, and bolts off, heading for the tree line, and quickly disappears into the brush. It was large, so as it was going through the trees and brush, it was making this terrible loud crashing sound, traversing off deeper into the backwoods. It about scared my pop half to death. I mean, even to this day, we have no idea what he saw, and he's told the story to me countless times. I wasn't there for that one. But before I move on to the next encounter, let me give you a little bit better geography on that encounter. So where he was setting up his gun range at with the tires and target practices, there's a few trees loosely spread out, and an actual tree line, maybe 60 or 70 yards away, completely visible from where he's at. When he first was alerted to movement, this thing, he said, was much closer to him, and somehow managed to run by him, eluding him, hiding in the trees. When he went to look, this thing was already behind a tree, getting ready to watch him or do something. He said that its entire demeanor was very suspicious. It was acting shady, like it was not only trying not to get caught, but that it was up to something, and mentioned that this thing did not like it that my dad spotted it, because its entire expression changed once they made eye contact, like it was telling my father, "You're not supposed to see me." That was back when I was probably around 15 or 16. I wasn't there for that, but my father has told me that many times. The next encounter would be when I was about 18. I was just finishing my senior year of high school, and I was home with my dad one evening, digging holes in the back. After a little bit, my father went inside for something. I can't remember what, so it was just me out there alone. The house is maybe roughly 100 feet in front of me, directly in front of me. I'm surrounded on my right, left, and behind of woods. So there I go again, digging, completely ignoring. And then I notice everything around me goes completely silent. But looking back, it was the eeriness of the whole thing that I picked up on. And then I just continued on digging, because I thought it was strange, but just thought, whatever. So I kept digging, ignoring the strange now silence. That's when I kept hearing rustling all around me. It sounded like some big animal was moving just beyond eyesight off in the trees. I would occasionally glance over to see if there was anything, thinking it might be a bear or maybe a cow, since there are ranches around here, and sometimes cows tend to get lost sometimes. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded more like a really big person, trying to be quiet, sneaking through the trees. My dad owns a lot of acres and trees back here, so I can't think of any reason why there would be anybody back here. The terrain isn't exactly the nicest, and there's nothing out here to get, steal, or have any interest in, period. Plus, it's all backcountry, so there's really nothing of interest out here. As I'm sitting there digging, and I'm thinking all of these things, it's all running through my mind, and I'm trying to process what's going on, and my father still has not returned. I begin to feel like something was watching me, very closely. Not just watching me, but intently watching me, like they were making a maniacal plan to do something to me. I got really creeped out, stopped what I was doing, and just thought, you know what, it's not worth it. I'll just walk back to the house, tell my father, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And that's exactly what I did. So as I get back to about maybe 20 feet away from the house, I hear what sounds like a mix between a low guttural growl, kind of like a lion would make, and a very deep hiss. If I could describe it to you in terms of animal noises, I guess combine a lion with a Komodo dragon maybe, and you have that same kind of growl hiss quality. That's kind of what it sounded like. But here's the issue. Since the trees run far behind me, all the way to the side of the house in front of me, I never heard it once walk parallel with me from where I was at digging that hole, all the way to about roughly 20 feet away from my back door. And what that means is by the time I heard that noise, it had walked parallel with me to keep up with me, because that noise was just off to my left, maybe no more than 50 feet, because the tree line isn't straight. It kind of curves and weaves in and out. And at this spot, it was really maybe 50 feet away from me at most. So whatever was there was right in the trees, tucked away just enough that I could not see it. But it was certainly keeping tabs on me. I was done for the day at that point. My walking quickly turned into a sprint. I ripped open the back door, told my father what had happened. Luckily, he took my concern very seriously and just told me to keep a weapon. Now, during this time, I did not think at all that this was the same unknown animal he encountered a couple years back. This was just its own isolated, terrifying incident. As the year would progress on, we never saw it, but we definitely felt the strange feelings of being watched, like there's just something off in the tree line that we can't quite discern, or the weird sounds, this weird, strange, raspy breathing that we can't quite place. My dad likes to think it was a hog, but it sounded different than a hog. And then, finally, in the following year, now I'm about 19, and we go fishing. It's about September or October. It was still warm out, and hadn't yet reached the cool point in fall, so probably early October would be my best guess. There's a small creek, about 5 or so miles away from our house. My dad and I love to go fishing, recreationally. We're not professional at it, but it's something we love to do to go for an off-time outing event. So we get to this creek, the same creek we've been going to for years. And right as we get to our spot, the same spot we've been going to for years and have had no prior issues, we smell this terrible odor. I can't even begin to describe it. It was kind of a rotten smell, but it had a unique smell profile to it. I wish I could describe it to you. It just smelled like dirty, rotten death, but there was an underlying stink that I just can't put my finger on. It was really thick in the air. No, it wasn't a musty odor, or anything that people think or smell with Bigfoot. I've had an encounter with Bigfoot myself, but I'll get to that in probably a separate email. This smelled entirely different. Imagine maybe leaving a goat carcass out in the hot sun for a few days, and then adding hot garbage around that, and then adding an extra layer of earthy dirtiness to it. That's kind of what it reminded me of. Stinky bog death. My father and I make a comment about how strange the odor is, but quickly get to fishing, and just try to ignore it the best we can. After maybe 20 minutes, the smell seems to be intensifying and not dying down. My dad mentions there might be a carcass somewhere close by, which could be the cause of the smell. So we decide that maybe we should go looking for it, or change spots entirely, just to see which direction we should go. Right when that happened, both my father and I's attention is turned across the creek to this large opening or a clearing in the brush, where this, what I can only describe to you as a reptile man, steps out and walks directly towards us, on 2 legs, 2 feet, mind you, the same as a human being. It looked very gaunt, very frail, but also lean and muscular at the same time. The expression on its face was that of anger, and it was walking directly at us. But one thing I'll never forget, besides how scary it was the sheer intensity in its eyes. Like it wanted to hurt us. It was going to, had it gotten the chance to. My dad, quickly reacting, pulled out his Glock, fired a few shots at this thing, and it screamed and let out this terrible noise that I've never heard from an animal ever in my life. We threw down our fishing equipment and just ran towards the vehicle, something my father has always been very adamant about never doing. Never run from an unknown predator. But this was something else entirely different. We don't even know what this was. We didn't look back either to see if this thing continued its pursuit. We made it back, about a quarter of a mile back to the truck, and we got out of there pretty quickly. We did come back to the creek the next day for our fishing equipment, which was still there. Again, because this was kind of backcountry, not that many people go to this creek, unless you're local. And at that point, we all pretty much know each other anyway. So didn't have to worry about anybody stealing our stuff, which is nice. But this funky creature, it was weird looking, man. It kind of had a very elongated head. Think of maybe like an iguana or some large lizard. And its body was very skinny, but still very lean. It was a strange dark and pale green that kind of interchanged. I could see some faint muscles on its stomach, chest, and legs, but that was about it. And it seemed to have a tail. But it all happened so fast, we watched it for maybe a few seconds as it walked towards us, and didn't waste any time. And after we shot at it, we heard it scream, but never looked to see if it was chasing us, which I'm sure it did. And maybe we encountered its territory, or got close to its den. I don't know. One thing I know is that we've never smelled that stink before. And since all these happenings, we had since gone to that creek to fish or just to hang out. And as a matter of fact, the last time we had visited this fishing spot was probably back in June or May. So, really, I don't know what you want to title this. I guess you can call it the Backwoods Texas Lizard Man. But whatever it is, I'm glad I haven't seen it since. After I hit about 20 years old, I moved away to a friend's, and we've been roommating for a while before I finally found a good career to go on to. That involves being in a little more civilized area, with more buildings, not so much backwoods. Do I miss the backwoods? Yeah. Do I miss seeing that thing? Not so much.
Hi, what lurks beneath? Before I tell you this, I trust you'll keep my name anonymous, and my location anonymous as well. And I also trust that you'll at least hear me out, and if I'm lucky, read my story. I know you're a busy man, and so I bet with all the stories you get, you probably don't have much time. Well, here's mine, and feel free to use it if you'd like. I lived in the swampy areas of Illinois for a very long time. I was deer hunting in the swamps, well, about 3 years ago now. This day in particular was very foggy, and I was busy walking along a path in the swamp. I heard a noise that was not something I'm used to hearing. It was like this very fast pitter-pattering, except the pitter-pattering was not that of light weight. These were heavy, more like thuds against the ground. I knew it was something because, again, I never heard anything like this before. Thinking maybe it was an alligator, I got down, crouching and listening for a moment. It was actually coming up in the trees around me, not on the ground. I'm thinking to myself, what the? And then I hear branches kind of breaking and moving up in the trees around me. So I get up from a crouched position, and I'm looking around. Instantly, as I turn behind me, I see these glowing pairs of eyes looking at me. This was during the day, mind you, so my visibility wasn't exactly poor. What I was looking at, I have no explanation for. It was just this big creature. It looked very dinosaur-like, if I can describe it. I had a hard time seeing the entirety of the thing, even though the light was good, because of how it was holding onto the tree. It was kind of crouched, on a large branch, actually, higher up in the trees. It had a pretty big head, and looked to be bigger and taller than I was. I didn't waste any time. I ran back to my truck, and I've never really sat down to tell anybody this before. But I know what I saw, and it was not a deer. What this thing was, I don't know. To me, it reminded me of some failed genetic experiment somebody tried to do by splicing human and dinosaur DNA. Sure, it sounds like a science fiction plot gone wrong, but that's what I saw. Listen, there ain't nothing like living right on the edge of the Great Dismal Swamp over here in Camden County, Virginia. All sorts of strange sounds, sights, and what have you. My family and I have experienced a handful of spooky, unexplainable things that don't make sense. This has been going on since I was just a little kid. My daddy and I have seen beasts of the swamp come right up to our house and press their faces against the back window. Sometimes it's just one of them. Sometimes it's several of them. And they would case the house, looking for spots to try and pry the doors open to get in. These creatures are dangerous. They look sort of like wolves. The faces are dark in color. These things walk on their hind legs, just like a person, and not a dog. They have short snouts and very human facial features, high jawbones, human-like facial structures, and sunken-in eyes that are very striking. The eyes, they have this unnatural orange glow to them, like something out of a horror movie. It's always scared us to death when these things show up. You can feel it. The first time I had an encounter was when I was a 10-year-old little girl, and I was lying in my bed, drifting off to sleep, or almost, when all of a sudden, my room got really dark. I had my blinds and curtains completely open, and my head was against the wall, right underneath my window. Something really big stood in front of my window to block the light coming through, and in that moment as a kid, I turned around, half curious and half scared, and saw the horror that stood on the other side of my window. It just stood there and watched me, and gave me a small smirk and looked away. I was terrified. Those aren't the only other critters we got out here either, because my daddy has seen what he called lizard men emerging out of the swamp waters nearby at night. Sometimes they're drawn toward the porch light at night, so we make sure to keep all outside lights off if we absolutely can. He don't like to take any chances. One time, one of these things walked right up to our car in our carport and hid in the dark. You can hear it making this clicking noise, and you could see the glowing eyes that it had. My daddy fired his gun, and it still didn't even move. Anything that isn't afraid of a gun is something to be feared. When I say the swamp is dangerous, I mean it. Animals that are not supposed to exist thrive out there, and when they don't have to worry about being found, they can just torment those who live near the home without ever worrying. I wanted to mention this before I ended the email. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, we'll find random dead animals all around outside the house. They look to be like they've just dropped dead mid-step. It's so weird. Animals that aren't even really common around here either. We found a dead coyote once by our carport that looked like it had just fallen over and died. No signs of any poison, struggle, nothing. We found a boxer dead too. A few cats, raccoons, all died the same way. My daddy thought they were getting into poison somewhere, but no one around here, nor any of us, lay out poison that these things can get into. More answers than questions at this point. The worst is during the spring and fall, where at night, you can hear all sorts of awful noise. The swamp will get really quiet, and you'll start to hear either these loud dinosaur roars and screams. It sounds like something out of a movie, and it sounds big. Then other times, you'll hear this deep roar that sounds like it's coming from a huge wolf. No doubt it's the swamp creatures that paid me a visit when I was a little girl. The sounds are incredibly loud at night. Other neighbors swear they heard a car being smashed into a tree. Other neighbors claim they will sometimes hear things in their backyards and driveways. I know the folks around here are very cautious and even have spotlights all around to ward these things away. From our experience, the swamp creatures are drawn to the light, and we're not sure why. The swamp creatures are very intelligent and know how to find food without anybody noticing. Maybe this is why they come toward the light. Sorry for so many things that don't make sense. We are trying to make sense of it ourselves. All we know is we have a swamp full of critters, like lizard men, and giant dogs that walk on their hind legs. We don't know what to do. I believe my friends and I had an encounter with a werewolf, or some sort of werewolf entity. For the record, I'm a 17-year-old kid, and because of COVID, a lot of my friends and I were left with nothing to do. We are avid watchers of ghost hunters and paranormal investigations, and decided it would be a good idea to do our own EVP session out in one of our oldest cemeteries in town. So, we waited one night till around midnight, where the four of us can sneak out and go. We get there about midnight, and the cemetery has graves that date back to the early 1800s. It's not very large, but it holds about 70 graves, if I had to take a wild guess. There's a lot of trees and coverage, especially now that spring has come and everything is grown in. The cemetery has your typical black spiral fencing around, but beyond that is heavy trees and forest, so you can't just walk by on the street and look in. It might even be privately owned, so technically, we were actually probably breaking and entering. Oh well. There's a couple of mausoleums on the far side that I believe were owned by some of the original families here. We found a large gravestone that was sitting by this large dead tree, and thought it would be the perfect place and time to sit down and do our session. We began our EVP session, asking some simple questions. Being summertime, everything around us was quiet, but I've never been to a graveyard at night, so I was already on edge. In my head, I was thinking crickets should be making noise, but they weren't. My friend kept saying that he felt the energy change around us, and we were invoking the wrong spirits. I thought he was just pulling my chain, because I had not felt a thing, and I'm sitting right next to him. Then, we heard a noise, maybe 50 feet away, behind a couple of the other graves that sounded like rustling, and leaves crunching. At this point, my friend is freaking out and thinking demons are going to come and take us. Oh, I should also mention that we only have our phone flashlights for whatever reason. Why we decided not to grab our flashlights at home, I don't know. Maybe we were far too excited. It was a heavily cloud-covered night, lots of overcast, so there was no light from the moon. We continued our session and asked a few more questions with my friend while he is shaking. He interrupts me mid-question, says he thinks there's something over there watching us and points. I said, "You're just paranoid." So I shined the flashlight over there, and all of us, at the same time, we see these tiny red orbs and these tall pointed ears coming from out behind a really large family tombstone, about 40 feet away. My friend jolts suddenly, saying, "What is that thing? Is that a demon?" I kept my ground and stood still, and I whispered in his ear, "Let's get out of here," really slowly. Whereas my other two friends were huddled right behind me. We all stood up slowly and backed away to the far side of the cemetery, where this thing continued to watch us and not move from beyond the gravestone. Due to its location, we were actually backing up away from the entrance, and we needed to find a way to kind of slyly get around. So we hid behind a couple of tombstones, and each of us took turns making a beeline for the entrance. We did this one at a time, without this thing ever seeing us, or so we like to think. That's the only and last time I'm ever doing an EVP session in a graveyard, and it's kinda killed my desire to do any ghost hunting or paranormal investigation. Since we saw the tops of its ears and its eyes, it looked like your typical werewolf. My friend, the one who was freaked, is convinced we summoned a demon and refuses to talk about it. But honestly, I don't exactly know what happened. I believe we saw something, and potentially a werewolf spirit, or maybe a werewolf, even though I can't exactly say that's what it was. I haven't told my parents or any of my other friends about what happened, so I'm desperately looking online for answers and people I can talk to about it. We were actually planning on bringing out a Ouija board out there, but with the way the events transpired, boy, I'm glad we didn't. Who knows what else would have happened? Part of me wonders if us trying to do an EVP session called this thing in, or if it just happened to be lingering around nearby and saw us and took its chance to watch us and be curious. I've looked online a little bit, and I have seen some similarities between people seeing werewolves in graveyards, but it seems to be mainly Indian burial grounds as the common denominator. I don't know my geography terribly great, but I'm pretty sure there aren't any native reservations or anything around here, so that's checked off the list.
Had we not spotted it, who knows if it was truly trying to creep closer and maybe grab one of us. I don't feel like it had the best intentions considering it was hiding and trying to stay incognito. At the same time though, it did reveal half its face and upper head to watch us from afar. I felt it was more curious, but my feelings could very well be wrong. After all, I felt that nothing would happen, so I was wrong there. Maybe it was waiting for the right time to grab one of us, like I said. I'm just glad we didn't stick around to find out. Somehow, when we made our exit out of the graveyard, hugging the outer perimeter wall, we didn't see it anymore, which was equally frightening. I don't know where it went. Maybe it was there guarding someone's grave. Maybe it was someone's pet. I don't know. People say there's a certain kind of energy that lingers around old graveyards, but whether that's true or false, I can't exactly say. I didn't initially feel anything different about the atmosphere around us when we first entered, nor did I really when we left. I was just seeing this creature. I never felt a sensation of anything wrong per se. Anyway, I'm not here to turn this into a novella. I just have no desire to ever return to a graveyard to do any sort of EVP session at nighttime again. I would have gone during the day, and it might have been a different scenario. I'll never know now, because I am staying far away. Thanks for reading.
Hi there, what lurks beneath. My name is Gale, and I'm here to tell you about some sightings that I've had all throughout the swamps of Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and even parts of Florida. I have had the luxury of living throughout the entire country in multiple states. To name a few: New Mexico, Oregon, Colorado, Texas, New York, and of course Louisiana. Now, they say Louisiana is actually a hotbed for paranormal and witchcraft, but it's also home to terrors of the swamp, as I like to call them, because they're things that once you see, you wouldn't believe them if nobody told you about them. Most people won't believe me, but I've seen some crazy stuff out in the swamps. Things that you think can only appear in your nightmares. But no, you would be so wrong to assume otherwise. Creatures that can kill you, worse than moccasins or alligators. One time, I was actually out in the bayous with thick smog rolling in, and I seen this, I kid you not. What I didn't know at the time was I thought it was a massive alligator, but it was actually an alligator humanoid. But as this thing rose out of the water and grabbed this 5-foot alligator and tore it into pieces, I was able to get a much better sight. It looked to be part man, part alligator, so I kind of call it the alligator man. But this thing was a hulking demon. It had to have been at least 10 feet tall, covered in thick muscles, rippling, scales everywhere, and a massive hulking body. I'm talking like a football player on steroids, maybe 4 to 5 feet at the shoulder width, completely hulking and massive like I said. It's terrified me to death, and that's only one instance that I've seen. Luckily, this thing was too busy eating an alligator to really pay attention to me rowing by. I've seen dogmen out here in the swamps too. That's why there's just certain spots that I refuse to go to, because they are very intelligent predatory animals. I've been followed by what I assume was a pack of them. They were staying just beyond the reach of the trees, keeping an eye on me. And at times, when I'd look just right, I could see the faint glow of their eyes staring at me, making sure I wasn't wandering too far off from whatever trap they were setting up ahead. See, the swamps are just not meant for people. They aren't meant for human survival, period. I believe that even some of the native tribes had a hard time surviving deep in the swamp. In fact, depending on who you talk to, they'll give you some pretty hair-raising details about bog creatures and other things that live below the swamp waters. Everything from summoning and witchcraft to flesh and blood creatures. There's all sorts of terrors out here, especially at nighttime. Where do you think fiction pulls a lot of their ideas from? I've had the misfortune of seeing many of these swamp creatures myself to understand their existence, as well as to know where Hollywood gets their inspiration from. In fact, many of my close friends that I've acquired over time
are also avid adventurers of the swamp, and have their own encounters with what they refer to as the skunk ape, something many might not know of unless they live down here in this giant swamp area. I haven't seen one yet myself, but I've seen enough of the other horrors in these parts that it's more than enough for me. I don't really believe in Bigfoot, but I would imagine that they too live down here. I don't live in the swamps anymore, but I've spent enough time to know what I'm talking about. Again, there's just certain parts of the area that you kind of just want to stay away from. And believe it or not, too many people will go out venturing too deep into the swamp. Number one, it's just not safe. And number two, you tend to run into things that let you know that you're too far out. Like the crocodilian humanoids, for example. I've only ever seen one, but it was enough for me. Somehow, I came across your videos before messaging you, and I happened to click on one of the Reptilian videos. It was about an older gentleman who, just like me, wandered out into the thick bayous and encountered these same humanoid beings. That's how I know I'm not crazy. When I'm hearing written and verbal accounts of other people reciting the same sightings that I've had, the same details of the same creatures, it just means they're out there, and we are not supposed to be in their territory. I try to take the native approach on the whole thing. If you respect them, hopefully they'll just leave you alone. But be aware, they are the alpha predators of the swamp, along with dogmen and whatever else lives out there. It's not just the entire Louisiana area either. Some of the sightings I've had span all the way into southern Alabama and the surrounding areas. It can be incredibly dangerous, even more so at nightfall. A very close friend of mine, who's actually far more of an adventurer than I am, encountered what he believed to be a den of some sort of large predatory animal, or animals. He was deep and far out in the swamps, near Texarkana actually. For those who don't know, that's right around the border of Texas and Arkansas in a small town called Texarkana. I could be wrong on my geography, so if you know that I'm wrong, please correct me. But anyway, I want to say he was either north or east of this location. He did not give me exact coordinates, but he found this dugout, as he describes it, and that led into a very large tunnel, wide enough and tall enough for him to slightly crouch and go into. He said that it led probably about 30 feet down at a sharp slope and dropped off into a very large open room. The entire room was completely dug out, is how he described it, with a ceiling taller than his head, probably around 10 to 12 feet in height, if he had to guess. That was probably about 20 to 30 feet in length. Again, these are just guesstimates. He only had a tiny flashlight, so he couldn't see well, but he said the odor was unlike anything that he's ever smelt before. It was an overpowering smell of death, blood, and rot, like that room had just been filled full of carcasses left to rot in the swamp. However, upon shining his light and looking around a little bit, he couldn't find any trace or source of the smell, but he did see that at the other end of this dugout room, the tunnel led deeper into this den, which he didn't continue to go down. He said he got a really bad feeling in the pit of his stomach, like he needed to leave now, or that something was going to be approaching him very soon. Safe to say he got out of there, and luckily, in one piece. But it just goes to show you, there are things in the swamp that we should stay away from. What's kind of eerie is when he was explaining to me the details of this den, and how it was dug out, and the way it was dug out. He said it almost appeared to be dug out with a tool-like object, that it wasn't just hands, or it wasn't just like an animal had dug it out with their claws. I don't know. The whole thing is very disturbing to hear. And he said, why would there be a person that dug out a chamber that large? And even though I've seen my fair share of stuff out in the swamp, this is a man who is far hardier than I am. In fact, when he was a little younger, he nearly had his right leg taken off by an alligator by surprise. So he doesn't scare easily. And when he tells me he was terrified and could feel in his gut that something was wrong and he needed to leave, that's really saying something. I take his opinion and word very seriously. He's never let me down and doesn't make up stories like this. He's not that kind of guy. When I prompted him with more questions about the den, he said that again, he has no idea how many chambers or pathways this thing went down into. But the pathway he could see that looked like it led down into another chamber, he said he felt like there might be something down there. But he did not hear anything, any movement, any shuffling, nothing. Only the ghastly strong odor of death and blood, and again, with no source of the smell. After he got out of there, he said it was even more humid and dank in there than you can imagine it being, since the swamp is already pretty bad. This friend is also one of the same friends who has had multiple run-ins with a skunk ape too. And trying to think about it, trying to think logically, of course, I can't attribute that den to a cougar, beavers, or bears, or any other natural animal that occurs in the swamp. So I really have no idea what would build a chamber that large, or a tunnel, mind you, with not even their bare hands or claws, but some sort of tool object like what he described. This same friend knows well about my own encounters with what I call the alligator man, the same creature that I saw pick up a 5 to 6 feet alligator, tear it in half, and eat its guts right in front of me, rising up out of the water in the thick fog. And to think, had I just rowed a little bit over, I would have landed right on top of this thing, and it would have capsized my tiny little boat in the swamp. Scary. I felt sending you this email was very important, since you already seem to have a wealth of knowledge and information that you're sharing and putting out there anyway. I thought I would send you mine and add to the ever-growing pile, so that way people who have these sightings and experiences don't bottle themselves up and feel crazy and feel like a lunatic having to keep all this information inside their head. Because I'm telling you now, you gotta let it out. Other people deserve to know that this kind of stuff is out there, and they need to protect themselves and understand the true dangers of being out in thick wooded areas. I'll keep you up to date and let you know if I encounter anything else, or if any of my friends have any more horrifying stories they can share. Many of them do, so I'll go ahead and reach out to them in the coming weeks and see if I can't muster up anything from them worthy enough to share with you. Anyway, this is Gale signing out. I'll keep you up to date and let you know if anything else happens. Have a good one, and thank you again for all the information and hard work you put out.
My first memory formed when Hurricane Katrina had happened. I was 4 years old, and my family was urgently packing their things as needed to flee our home in New Orleans. We ended up driving off to my grandparents' house in a more rural part of the state. I recall looking at the TV a couple of days later and seeing live footage of the Six Flags amusement park being absolutely flooded with water, to such a severe degree that only its tallest points stuck out from the blue void that encapsulated it. I thought that instance in my life was where my fear of natural bodies of water developed. I was fine with swimming pools. In fact, I have many fond memories of going to pool parties and water parks as a kid, but that was because the water was chlorinated and clear. In most natural bodies of water, you can't see anything below a few feet at best, and even then, it was much murkier than man-made pools. You could have offered me $1 million, and I would still refuse to go further than knee-deep in a lake or ocean. To say it made my family vacations a bit difficult would be an understatement. Anyway, my grandpa passed away some years ago, and a few months back, my grandma did as well, leaving their house vacant with a whole bunch of stuff to sort through. Both of my parents were working, and because it was June at the time, I was freshly out of school. This left me as the only person in my family who had the time to drive up to my grandparents' house and determine what to keep, what to sell, what to throw away, and so forth. It would be my first time visiting the house since Katrina, so a solid 15 years. My family simply never made the time to go back after we'd found a new place to live in. We didn't even reside in Louisiana anymore. I pulled up to the house at around noon and got around to sorting as assigned. there really wasn't anything special. It was mostly just junk. As night fell, I decided to take a break, watch some YouTube, and eat some snacks. After I started a video, I heard a bizarre gargling come from outside. I don't know why at the moment, but my heart began to race. I paused the video, and a few moments later, it happened again. I was in full-on fight or flight mode now, but also incredibly confused. I looked out the sliding glass door that led to the back balcony to see what it was. I didn't find anything, but my eyes laying upon the swamp before me triggered a series of memories I had completely blocked out of my brain before then. After child me watched the Hurricane Katrina footage that night, I was about to sleep in the bedroom with the balcony when I heard that same gargling coming from the swamp. I went to look at it, and there, standing waist high in the water, was a creature I could best describe as skeleton-shaped, covered in moss, lily pads, and twigs. It was lanky, and it appeared to have no eyes. I suppose the strangest part is that I don't remember feeling scared upon seeing it. I was more intrigued than anything else. However, before I could do anything, my grandpa caught me standing there and told me to go back to sleep. But the same thing happened the next night, except this time, I spotted with the water up to its shoulders. I was intensely curious, so I went onto the balcony and down the stairs that led to the backyard. Even though this thing lacked eyes, only sockets where they would have sat, it still seemed to stare at me, and its gargling ceased. I said hello to it, and in response, it slowly submerged itself back in the water. Then, some seconds later, reappeared and slowly stood up, to the point where the water was only up to its knees. It began gargling again as water dripped off its body, and it slowly extended its bony hand to me, tilting its head. I figured it was friendly, and stepped forward while reaching my hand out, touching one of its hard, slimy fingers. For a moment, it didn't do anything, then wrapped its hand around my wrist, gently tugging at it, encouraging me to come into the water. I told it no and pulled back. It didn't like this. Its grip grew stronger, and it snapped its head back into an upright position. Its gargling turned into hissing, and the shrubbery on its hands seemed to tie itself around my wrist as well. But at that point, who knew what was really happening? Before I knew it, I was being dragged into the murky depths. I screamed as loud as I could, but was silenced when I was forced face down into the water. I could not see anything, and my lungs quickly filled with distilled mud as I thrashed around to the best of my ability in hopes to escape. My father pulled me out, and I coughed up the water and began crying. He tried to calm me down, but there was no point. I remember screaming to him about the skeleton creature, but he just seemed confused. If I were in his shoes, I would have just assumed I had a nightmare and sleepwalked into the swamp. Once I finally began to relax, I was brought inside, given a bath and a change of clothes, and something to eat. I ended up spending the rest of the night in a sleeping bag on the floor of my parents' room. I have some flimsy memories here and there of being put on a child's leash for a couple of years, but I never considered that this event was probably what made my parents decide to do such a thing. No doubt in my mind that the event is what truly triggered my fear of natural bodies of water as well. I was pulled out of my recollection of thoughts to the sound of gargling again. I knew there wasn't much I could do. I refused to sleep outside, and I didn't even want to look out the window. I didn't want it to catch a glimpse of me. I had brought my AirPods, so I continued to watch YouTube and Netflix until I fell asleep. I'm surprised I achieved such a feat. My nightmares that night were awful. I dreamed that this skeleton stood outside my window, watching me sleep
and that my bedroom began filling with swamp water until there was only a few inches between me and the ceiling. And when I woke up to the sun coming in through the curtains, I had never been more grateful. I knew I didn't want to stick around this place much longer, but at the same time, there was a lot of work to be done. I wasn't a foolish child anymore. I just needed to stay in the house. Even then, if it did come into contact with the thing, chances were I would be able to fight back by now. It probably only seemed ridiculously strong as a child because I was only 4 years old. The dumb part of me wanted to go out of my way to antagonize this thing, to seek my revenge, but I ultimately knew better than to do that. It would be best if I kept my distance. I continued sorting through my grandparents' junk, the daytime being slow-paced and uneventful, which I was grateful for. However, soon enough, I had stumbled upon something peculiar, and that was my grandmother's paintings. They were normal at first. During her lifetime, she depicted a lot of natural, realistic scenes of forestry and mountains. But then, I found the paintings of the swamp. As I just mentioned, they were completely ordinary when I began to sort through them. But then there were more. As I went through the paintings, I began to spot the creature in them. With every painting, its body ascended further up from the water, and it only got closer to the foreground. A shiver went up my spine. It felt like I shouldn't be seeing this stuff, and I didn't want to touch it anymore. I shoved the paintings back into a corner and knew I had had enough. It was sunset by now, and I wanted to be out before dark so I wouldn't hear the awful gurgling of the thing. As soon as I made my way to my car, the familiar noise made its way into my ears. I could not help but look back. There, in the distance, I could make out the creature in the water, with nothing but its neck and head above the murk. Upon me spotting it, it slowly descended back down until it was no longer visible. I wasn't going to mess around anymore. I got in my car and I drove the hell out of there, not daring to look back. On my way home, I called up my parents and told them about what had happened and the memory I had resurfaced. My parents were surprised to learn that I had no memory of nearly drowning, as apparently it impacted me for a long time, that I was constantly anxious and wandering around, anticipating the skeleton to return. They claimed that my behavior persisted until a little after I started first grade, and once it subsided, they took that as a cue to let me off the leash. There haven't been any problems since then. I mean, until now, I suppose. My parents, while not super religious or spiritual, let me know that they thought it was best that nothing from the house was brought back into ours. So, I ended up pulling over on the side of a country road, littering my grandparents' belongings into a field. I hoped that nothing would happen to anybody who decided to pick them up, and even though it had been a couple of months, I still worry about it. I returned home, and nothing happened. My family and I don't really talk about it. I hear now that Hurricane Laura is going to hit the entire state of Louisiana, and although it is a horrific disaster, I unapologetically hope that it decimates my grandparents' house and the land along with it. I do not know whether or not that thing is living, or a ghost, paranormal, or whatever. It doesn't matter. It didn't even matter that I was hours away from it at this point. I wanted it gone, as any sane person would. You know, it still perplexes me how my grandparents appear to live peacefully for years with that thing, whatever it was. Maybe they had no clue it was real, and my grandmother saw it in her dreams like I did, and inserted it into her paintings because of that. Regardless, speculating on it is useless, because they're dead now, and it is impossible to ask. In case you're wondering, I still do have my strict standards when it comes to navigating natural bodies of water. If anything,
This entire event has reinforced my fear. Take my advice if you will. Don't go treading in murky water. You never know what can be waiting for you in there. I was on this big adventurous hike to a lake with my friends. We had to walk through at least a couple of miles of woods from where we parked to get to said lake. And for the sake of the story, I'm going to keep the name of the lake anonymous, but I can tell you that it was a very popular lake. Still is. And since I was leading me and my few friends, I was of course in front. And as we're walking through the woods to get to said lake, I noticed something weird. I saw this big shadow, and I looked at it, trying to figure out what it was. I noticed it was kind of watching us from in between some trees, and it stayed perfectly still, so that's why I didn't exactly catch it at first. My first inkling was that it was maybe a man, but the more I looked at it, even with how dark it was, it looked wrong. Now, before I go on, you might be thinking, oh, well, you just saw Bigfoot. But I'm telling you, Bigfoots don't look like this thing did. This had a much more reptile-like appearance. The head was very long. The arms were very long. It kind of reminded me of a serpent head on a human body, with scales and everything, but just dark. After looking at it, I stopped my friends and had them look too, just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. As soon as we all stopped and began gawking at this thing, it immediately tilts its head up to look at us and starts jolting after us. We all start screaming and began running back the way we came. We could hear it chasing after us in the woods, and it caught up very quickly. I mean, it was probably no more than 30 yards away at max, and it was in a section of woods where it wasn't so thick we couldn't see it. It's like it was waiting there for somebody, for us. The thing chased after us though, and it was moving so fast. I didn't think it was possible. We didn't know what to do, so we ran and we ran. And we were able to ran back to where we had initially parked. I was so scared. I mean, all of us were. We were all looking at each other like, did that just happen? What was that? I'm not sure why, but I believe whatever this thing was could have caught up to us and grabbed us. But it didn't. It's like it wanted to chase us out for whatever reason. We were only maybe a half mile in the trail, and we all said that we could all hear it almost right behind us, right in the trees. I'm not sure why it never reached out and tried to grab any of us. That's kind of a mystery to me. So we all get in the car and we drive off, and we're trying to speculate what it was. What animal could it have been? A few of us talked and argued that it was a Bigfoot, but Bigfoots don't look like that. Not that I'm aware of, at least, unless I'm missing something. Yes, we were all terrified, but I strongly feel that this was something else entirely. I don't know if lizard men exist or snake men exist, but that's the closest thing I could even compare it to. I'm still not exactly sure what this was to this day, so I'm hoping, since you're kind of the monster master here, you can kind of help me pinpoint exactly what it is. I'm just hoping you'll respond back to me, and in an exchange of emails, can give me some much needed answers, because what I saw just doesn't make sense. Alright, let's get to the story. I won't bore you with long, unimportant backstory details, so to cut to the chase, me and a good buddy of mine were exploring and hiking up in northern Colorado, not too far outside of Boulder, in the general vicinity of the Rocky Mountain National Park. I think closer to Red Feather Lakes, if we're trying to get an exact location. And at one point or another, during our several day-long hike, we had found the mouth to a very small cave. It kind of led at a 45-degree angle down into the ground, so the opening was big enough, and we weren't properly equipped, but we thought, what the heck, might as well explore what we can, and deviate from our already out-of-schedule hike,
because we were supposed to be back a day or so before, but we were having such a good time that, whatever, our family could suck it up. The opening led to a rather small chamber, maybe 20 feet across and 10 feet tall. Tall enough that we could both stand up in. We thought it was pretty cool, and since we didn't have a map of any of the caves around here, him and I are both aware that there are many uncharted little caves all throughout this mountain range, even if these caves are so small that they're not even considered caves. And I know you gotta be careful, because some of these could be considered dens. We kinda shined our lights around, looked around casually, didn't see much, didn't notice much. We were just thrilled to be in here, until we shined our lights a little further, and saw that it dips down about another 45 degrees, down deeper into the earth. Debating on whether we should go further, because we only had flashlights that weren't that great, and we didn't want to stray too much away from the light outside, bleeding into the first chamber. We decided, what the heck, let's go a little further. We felt a little adventurous, so we press on and go down to this next little tunnel, and now it's almost completely pitch black. But this next portion, this next chamber, opened up much larger, to a chamber that we couldn't even see all the way across. Due to the angle at which we were at, it sloped down even further in this large opening, kind of like a mini cliff, and our light would not shine all the way down to the bottom, so there's no telling. My buddy picks up a rock and throws it down there, and you could hear it kind of boom, 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 all the way down to the very bottom. It sounded like at least a several 100-foot drop. I guess not uncommon to find tunnels and caves like these. We stood there for about another moment or more, figuring that we certainly did not have the equipment to scale this. We just decided to cut our losses and headed back to the first chamber. As we're exiting out of the first chamber, back out into daylight, we hear this sound coming from within the cave. It sounded like a dragon. I mean, I know that sounds pretty crazy of a description, but I can't think of another description to use. It would be the stereotypical sound you would hear from some sort of large prehistoric reptile used in a Hollywood movie, I guess. At least, that's what came to my mind, and my friend's mind too. We heard this loud squawk, roar type sound. My friend and I both turned to each other and gave each other a look, like we're in complete disbelief, and a look like, did you hear that? Or was that just me? Are we crazy? We both look back, but don't see anything, and we hear the sound of something approaching, something big, coming into the first chamber. I mean, it couldn't be too big. The opening to the second chamber to the first was maybe 10 feet tall by maybe 6 or 7 feet wide, but we could hear something big moving, and when you look into the mouth of the cave, it only allows you so much light, so you can't see all the way to the entrance to the second chamber. We decided it was probably best not to stick around and find out, so we got out of there quickly and walked about maybe 500-600 yards into the thickness of the forest, where we could hear the sounds, those same exact dragon squawking sounds, I guess you'll call them, outside, probably back the way we came, back by the entrance or the mouth of this cave. It's definitely had a lasting impression on my friend and I anytime we're in the woods. I'm not saying at all that dragons exist or anything like that, but it did sound like some sort of pissed off large reptile. I don't know. I'm just glad that we didn't stick around to see what it was. I can only imagine.
Back in 2011, all the way up until 2014, I used to work as a 911 phone operator, and while I handled many disturbing phone calls, everything from emergencies to potential suicide, and even worse, everything you can imagine, there was always one that stuck out to me. For the sake of safety, I won't be mentioning the name of the county that I worked for, but I will say that it was in Southern California, in a rather large populated city you probably know about. That's all I'll say about that. The phone call in question was picked up around 12:32 a.m. by a woman who sounded to be around in her 50s. She was complaining that a large, upright, lizard-like person was trying to break into her house. I had sent dispatch to go check it out, but before that even happened, she ended up hanging up on me. And before she ended up hanging up, I heard glass breaking in the background and her screaming, and before that, she was claiming it was trying to get in. When I'd asked her to describe to me the person, she kept saying, "This isn't a person in a costume. This is something from hell." After this thing or person broke into the house, and you could hear the glass shatter, she screamed, and I lost the signal. I got in contact with the officer who arrived at the scene. The lady was missing, and there was a weird green-blue substance all over the side of her wall where the broken window was, leading out behind her house, and then just suddenly vanished. Is it possible that whoever or whatever this was had kidnapped her and taken her? But where? It's something that still haunts me, even as an individual who wasn't even actively on the case. I'm sorry for my story being so short, but that's all the details I have, and I thought it fit well within your realm of storytelling. Take care. After being recently divorced, me and my dog found a nice little place to stay with a beautiful backyard and a nice little creek running behind it, with some woods and swamp beyond that. The house itself is a pretty small place. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, maybe 1,200 square feet at best. It doesn't provide a lot, but is more than enough for me and my dog. I wouldn't exactly say I live out in the country, but I don't also live in a little suburban neighborhood either. I'm kind of tucked away, not too far from town, but just perfect. You know, the Goldilocks zone. Besides the strange things going on around here, it's actually a pretty beautiful place to live. I get all 4 seasons. The weather and the temperature is pretty moderate, at least what I'm used to. And my favorite part of all, it's quiet. Now that I cleared up all the necessary background info, let's get to the weird stuff that's been happening around here. Like I just mentioned to you, since getting divorced back in September of 2020, I ended up moving into this place right around Halloween of 2020. And weird things have been happening outside of the house ever since. Weird noises, strange sounds. Sometimes I could hear this weird water dripping noise, like a large drain dripping water outside my house. Loud, squishy sounding footprints right outside my house, like something weighing 800 or 900 pounds, walking through thick, dense mud. Except there is no mud around my house. It's all just dirt and grass. But the scariest thing that happened was back in January. I had woken up right around midnight to go let my dog out. As I go towards the back door and I let him out, he begins kind of freaking out, acting weird. Definitely not normal. But he's still going out, which I'm not sure what that was about. I just thought he was being dumb. And me being half asleep did not help either. He began whimpering more and more as he slowly paced towards the creek, which is maybe 40 or 50 feet away from my back sliding door. Then, I heard the weirdest, loudest groan I had ever heard. Immediately, it reminded me of something you'd hear from a large alligator or crocodile. That same low groan that they make. And just in that moment, this large shadow rises up from the creek that had to have been easily 8 or 9 feet tall. Incredibly large. And that's, to my horror, when I see it reach out for my dog. My dog starts going crazy, barking, going hysterical, which, again, is way out of his character. He's a very docile dog, and without hesitation, I reach down by the door, grab my .22, which I keep loaded at all times, since it's just me. And even though there are really no intruders, this was one exception where I needed to use it. I pick up my .22, take the safety off, and I fire 2 shots at this thing. I understand from you reading this, you might think I'm crazy, just firing at some unknown person or creature that I don't know what it is. But I'm here to tell you that based off the lighting, and based off the shadow that I saw, there was no way that this was a person, or somebody in a costume. This looked like some sort of human dinosaur alligator thing. It was incredibly large, thick, wide, tall, menacing, and terrifying, and had glowing yellow orangey eyes. But in the moment of all this happening, I wasn't thinking those thoughts. I wasn't sitting there wondering what this was. I simply just reacted to the situation. That something
was going after my dog. So after firing 2 shots at this thing, which was only a measly 22, it didn't even seem like it even really reacted to it. And I know I hit it, because it stayed stationary, did not even move. It didn't even act like it flinched, and I know I hit it dead on. But as soon as I fired twice, it retracted its arm, which was almost like a slithering motion, like a snake. Even though its arm was incredibly long, with long dangly claws, it then turned its entire body and head right towards me. I have never in my life, besides that moment, felt like literally pooping my pants out of fear. My dog comes running back toward me, full speed, whimpering, freaked out. So I slam the sliding glass door, lock it, close the blinds, while this thing begins to slowly pull its way and clamber out of the creek in my yard, slowly making its way towards my house. So I quickly make sure the blinds are closed, keep my 22 near me, pull my dog over to the living room, which is right next to where the sliding glass door is, and I call the police immediately. Let them know I have an intruder. So I sat there with my dog, quiet, waiting. An officer showed up within 10 minutes. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. He even went and checked out back for me. Nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything disruptive. Even out by the creek. Said he wasn't sure what I saw, or who I saw, but they must be gone now. Said he'll stick around for another hour, just to make sure everything is at peace, and the person doesn't return. He did, and then eventually drove away. Told me to let him know that if anything goes wrong, be sure to give him another call. Well, the next day, I went onto a local Facebook group and reached out to a local Bigfoot investigator. I don't believe in Bigfoot, but I have no idea what it was I was dealing with. Some unknown animal that I had never seen, and I figure if anything, this person might have answers. Him and I exchanged phone numbers, and we chatted on the phone for a little while, when later that afternoon, he came over to investigate himself. I told him my experience, and he initially thought it was a Bigfoot that I was dealing with. Even though I didn't believe, after taking me a bit back further into the woods beyond the creek, where it's a little more swampy, we found a couple of footprints, or what we believed to be footprints, that looked almost like a large lizard. I didn't even know what I was looking at, but he seemed to be very freaked out. Wouldn't tell me what they were, and told me he's leaving immediately, that what I'm dealing with is far worse than any Bigfoot. I wasn't even sure what he meant by that, but he seemed very panicked, very scared. After leaving, I just left it to me and my dog being on our own, and that we'll just have to handle the situation ourselves. The next few nights were calm, and nothing came of it. But then, about a week later, we heard the noise again. That loud groaning sound. That sounds just like a loud crocodile, except this time, I had heard it moving toward my house. Luckily, I kept all my windows locked, doors locked, windows and blinds closed completely. I wasn't going to risk giving this thing the opportunity to try and get in my house. I kept my 22 near me, although I'm sure to this thing wasn't much. Probably nothing more than a tickle gun, honestly. This went on again for another few nights, and then finally, after that, it was peaceful for a while, for maybe another few couple weeks, when one night, just back in February, probably closer to the 20th, I began hearing these strange roaring noises out off in the swamps, behind the forest, behind the creek. So, in total distance, probably 300 to 400 feet beyond my house. They were incredibly loud, and sounded exactly like what you'd expect from hearing a dinosaur, or something along those lines. It sounded like some sort of extremely large reptile. I have no idea if there's any correlation between what I saw and the noises that I've been hearing on and off. I'm pretty spooked and concerned that my measly 22 is not going to be enough to properly protect myself if this thing decides to take charge and try and break into my home. Is there any weapons you would recommend? Any way to properly defend yourself that you can recommend to me? I'm currently looking to move out of this place. I don't feel like it's safe anymore. While I've been battling this decision for a little while, and while the property and everything around here is beautiful and wonderful, I just can't risk being around whatever that is. This just happened 2 weeks ago, and has left me pretty freaked out. We got a knock on our door from a gentleman who looked to be about in his early 40s, terrified, begging us, asking if he could come in, saying that there was something after him, and he needed to call the police. Luckily, my husband answered the door, because nowadays, I probably wouldn't have let him in. So my husband let him in, used our phone, and he called the police. This man was hysterical, and we tried to ask him what he meant by something chasing him. He said he was just a few miles down the road, when he said we're not going to believe him, but this large thing that walked on 2 legs, that looked like a large serpent or snake, with yellow piercing glowing eyes, began chasing after his vehicle, grappled onto the end of his vehicle, and tore part of his bumper off, hissed at him, and tried pulling his car off the road. The man, clearly terrified, ended up driving up to the first house he saw, which was ours, still believing that this thing was pursuing him. Leaving his car still running, the man leapt out of his car, ran right up to our door, in hopes this thing did not chase him and follow him. Now my husband and I were pretty freaked out. Either this man was on drugs or hallucinating, or his story turned out to be real. The man did not appear to be on drugs at all. He was very clean cut, very upper middle class, wore decent clothes. I don't mean to be a judge of character, but he did not seem like a type that would be tweaking on drugs. My husband grabbed his handgun, and with a flashlight, slowly walked out to the man's car. Shining everywhere, didn't see anything. The car was still running, the interior lights still on, and the driver's side door wide open, just as he explained, as if somebody rapidly pulled up and jumped out of the car in fear. My husband slowly worked his way towards the back of the vehicle, where it looked like some large animal ripped part of his bumper off the backside of his small car. Upon further look, it looked like something with large claws and teeth pulled it off by sheer force. This unsettled my husband greatly, and he began looking around, looking for any signs of whatever it was chasing him. There was nothing, but my husband claimed he did not feel safe being out there, like he was being watched or at any moment could be attacked. He hastily made it back into the house, called the police. Police came, they took notes, and offered to escort the man home, driving behind his vehicle. He accepted the offer, thanked us for being so kind, shook both of our hands, and left. After that, my husband and I couldn't even sleep that night, thinking what on earth just happened to us. Even though this is a couple of weeks ago, and life for the most part is back to normal, and we haven't seen anything like he described, it still makes me wonder, what on earth really happened? What lives around here that we don't know about? I had my own creepy, eerie encounter back in 2004 when I was still in high school and used to have Saturday night Halo parties with a small circle of friends. It was pretty much the same thing every Saturday night. We would show up, Mom would order us a pizza, and we would just play Halo till the wee morning hours. Usually be pretty exhausted, but filled with enough soda, pizza, and adrenaline to sometimes carry us up to 4 or 5 in the morning. I remember that well, because we would usually get so excited, end up yelling and keeping his mom up all night, when after inviting 5 15-year-old boys over for a video game night, and having to get up for work early the next day, it was probably sleep suicide for her. But there's always one night that stands out to me, as was easily the creepiest, and I'm pretty sure if I talked to all my friends who were a part of that circle, they'd all remember the exact same thing. I can't remember the exact time in the morning, but I can tell you it was after 1 a.m., because on this night, his mom stayed up pretty late with us, just hanging out, talking, making food. She was actually one of the most coolest moms you could ever meet. She wouldn't play video games with us, but you could tell she tried to be into it with us, and try to sit and have conversation. It was really nice, and after a couple of glasses of wine, she made the decision to turn in for bed, since she'd have to be getting up early, like 5 or 5:30 in the morning, something like that. So we said our goodnights, and we continued staying up playing. My friend, I think, was getting up to grab a slice of pizza,
when we heard a sound outside the sliding glass door. Before I continue with my harrowing story, let me explain the layout of his house. So you first walk in, and you're greeted by an enormously oversized living room with his large TV right in the corner. So as soon as you step in and turn to your right, the TV is tucked in the corner, facing you at a diagonal angle. But if you were to turn your head directly straight, it would go right into the kitchen with a large island. Now keep walking straight. To your left would be the hallway where the bedrooms were. Keep walking straight, and now you're right at about the fridge. Now if you were to turn right, you would run directly into the island. So going around it are the sliding glass doors. His entire kitchen, dining room, and living room were just like one big open room. I think it was a custom house they had built, but that's irrelevant. The sound we heard outside was almost like an animal, but I actually thought it was somebody trying to open the sliding glass door. Thinking to myself, okay, maybe somebody's trying to play with us or play a prank on us, but also mildly worried in the back of my head because I realized none of us had stepped outside for any reason. But after maybe 20 seconds of this, the sound had stopped. We all had heard it. I thought it was weird, but just assumed it was probably a raccoon or something. So we went back to playing our skirmish death match. Maybe another 45 minutes rolls around, and now we all began to have this strange feeling. We all discussed it openly. We felt like there was something outside the house. I don't even know how to describe it to you. We never used the term paranormal, ghosts, or demonic entities, of course. But whatever it was, the electromagnetic energy around the house and in the house changed. It felt like you were standing next to one of those rubber balls. You know how, like, when you're a kid, somebody would take a balloon and rub it really fast against your hair, and then make your hair all staticky and stand up. And you could kind of feel the electricity in the air. That's kind of how it was, except all over the house. And we all noticed it, several of us making comments. We almost wondered if it was a thunderstorm that was about to happen. Then, on the outer wall, right where the TV is outside, we hear this incredibly loud thud, like something very large jumping 10 feet off the air onto the dirt. We didn't hear anything after that. So, we all got up, kind of wondering what on earth was that. We go to the window, which is closer to the opposite corner of where the TV is, and try to look out. There's no porch light, or really any light for a matter of fact on that side of the house. It was just pitch black. We didn't see anything. So things were getting weird, but nobody chalked it up to anything just yet. Now we go back to playing Halo, and now it's maybe closer to 2:30 in the morning, finishing off the pizzas that we had bought. I'll never forget this moment. We were playing a game called King of the Hill in Halo, where you have to try and control a small area of territory. I remember, I was just about to cap the time when we heard my friend's mom scream bloody murder. We all stop, look back. We hear her scream a second time, and come running out of the room, in a complete panic. We're asking her what's going on, assuming maybe a mouse had found its way in her bed, or maybe a snake. We had no idea, but we were all a little on edge with everything going on. And she's beginning to cry, saying there was this really creepy lizard face watching her from the window. We all assumed it was just somebody in a costume trying to play a prank. Now, the majority of us were very worried, but my friend, the one whose mom it was, decided to call the police right then and there, and we're going to catch this person who's trying to prank our house. While my friend is on the phone with the police, and they're about to send somebody over, his mom is still in hysterics because, for whatever reason, this grown woman was terrified at seeing a supposed man in a lizard costume staring at her through the window. But I guess I can't blame her. She was probably terrified that this person was planning on breaking in and doing God only knows what to her. So, now we're all freaked out, on edge. Halo has kind of taken a back seat, on pause, and the only weapon we have besides knives in the kitchen is a steel baseball bat. Now we're all kind of scared to go outside, but we determine if we go out in an entire group, whoever this punk is can't do anything. So,
We each grab a knife, and my friend, after getting off the phone with the cops, grabs his steel bat. We turn on the porch light, and we all step outside in a very close-knit formation. We're looking around, and we realize in that moment, we can't hear a thing. This was in May, so the night is usually alive with crickets and sounds. It was so quiet. It wasn't just quiet, but it was like an eerie quiet, like anything was about to happen. So here we are, all on edge, standing out on his front porch, weapons in hand, expecting some psycho in a lizard costume to come attacking us. We also had a flashlight. At least one of us did. The rest of us were poorly equipped with our phone's flashlight apps, which, in the dead of night, aren't really that bright. As we're all huddled together, looking around, expecting to see this psycho walking towards us, we see headlights coming our direction, and I bet we looked like fools, because it was the officer. He pulled up, very freaked out by seeing how freaked out we all were, about to draw his weapon, asking us if everything was okay, and we quickly explained that we were on edge and told him the situation. We were obviously able to calm down enough to not provoke any sudden action from an officer, like him shooting at us because we had weapons on us. So we calmly explained what was going on, and right then and there, as he's taking our statement, we all, the officer included, my friend's mom, and all 5 of us, hear this loud banging sound on the back side of the house. Right now, it's probably close to 3 a.m. We're all standing in the front driveway, speaking to this officer. We hear this noise, and immediately, all of our attention is brought back to that side. The officer, looking concerned, tells us all to quickly go inside, and he holds onto his gun and works his way towards the back of the house. We all run inside, lock the doors. Now we're freaked out, because whoever this intruder was trying to break in. It sounded like somebody throwing something heavy at the house. We actually hear the gunshot go off. Bam! Bam! My friend's mom starts screaming, and my friend tries to calm her down. But now we're all like, dude, what on earth? What if he had a weapon? What if he was trying to get in and kill us? After we heard the 2 gunshots, it went quiet. Probably about 7 or 8 minutes later, the officer knocks on our door, and he's pale white, tells us that whoever it was is now gone. We begin storming him with questions, like who was that? What happened? Why did you have to fire your pistol? And he calmly explained, as nerve-wracking as possible, that this person in a large reptile suit came charging after him, and he had to fire 2 shots. They apparently acted extremely hostile, and were faster than any person he's ever seen. Once he fired both shots, this person disappeared. So he did a full sweep of the perimeter, several times, didn't see anything, and for whatever reason, you could tell by the expression on his face, he was covered in cold sweat and was pale. Like there's more to the story that he wasn't telling us, that this wasn't just a person in a reptile suit. He seemed very short of breath, drained of color, and kept muttering to himself. He finally said that he's going to stay around, stick in the area, just in case this person decides to come back. Now none of us know what's truly going on, and we're all terrified to know that somebody might come and break in and potentially harm us, and they somehow survived 2 gunshots from an officer. The rest of the night went quiet, but we were all pretty much huddled together on the couch, just waiting for sunrise. I'd like to tell you I at least got an hour of sleep, but I really doubt it was even that. From that point forward, to probably 7 or 8 in the morning, it was kind of just a blur of adrenaline and fear, hoping this person does not come back. So this is where the story really changes. We go out there at 8 in the morning, because the officer comes back to talk to us, and one of our friends goes and scouts around, now that it's daylight, around the house. We all find large tracks walking all around the house, because the dirt at the side of the house, where this person had been, was very soft, and they left tracks. Instead of finding human prints, we found large prints, indented pretty deep into the soft ground. The only problem is, they were like 3 or 4 toed, and very alien looking. It literally looked like a giant reptile was walking around. Seeing that scared all of us, and I can tell, it even made the officer a bit unnerved. But he did a pretty good job of keeping his professional composure. That's pretty much my story. The only thing different that I would really add is that, as time would go on throughout the rest of high school, the mom would talk about going outside at night to smoke cigarettes or to take out the trash, and feeling very bad feelings at night, like she was being watched, or that somebody was out to get her. She never felt quite right after that experience. I think they ended up moving out of that house, but I can't remember. It's been so long. 16, 17 years now. The major things that crept me out were 2 things of my story. The first, the officer kept acting like he knew something and just wouldn't talk about it. And he seemed so sketched out over something that he saw or dealt with. I mean, he shot 2 shots off. That's saying something. The second is the tracks we found the following morning on a bright, clear, sunny day. There's no way a person in a suit made those tracks, so that can only really mean one thing. There's some sort of upright walking dinosaur that tried to break into the house, apparently. Whatever it was, or whoever it was, tried to attack the officer and failed. I would also like to conclude that it was probably more than a person, because why would a trained officer be so shaken up at what they had saw and shot at? That's just not very likely. And somebody who gets shot by a Glock doesn't just disappear. You go down, you get arrested, more police show up. The older I get, the more I'm convinced we dealt with something that certainly was not human.
I'm not exactly sure what I encountered, but the sighting of these things that weren't clearly human still haunts me. This is back in 2010, and I was in Colorado, bird watching. In fact, it was a beautiful Saturday morning, and I lived out on beautiful property with a large field off to my right. I was going to the bird feeder at the edge of my property, and out of the corner of my eye, I see 3 dark-colored creatures literally flying across the field towards my house. Completely panicked and terrified, I ran in the house and waited. My husband wasn't home, so I really had no weapons to defend myself. When my husband got home later, I didn't bother telling him what I saw, because he probably wouldn't have believed me. Then, a couple of days later, the following evening, I was birdwatching again, and as I went again to go to the bird feeder, I see these same strange 3 creatures flying towards the house again. Panicked, I run back in the house a second time, and I pull up my notebook and jot down exactly what I saw, what their descriptions looked like, because I didn't want to forget it. We didn't have a computer in the house at the time. Trust me, I know. Being 2010, you think everybody would be. There'd be other nights where, again, my husband wasn't home or was in bed, since he had to get up very early for work. I'd be sitting out on my porch alone at night, and I'd see strange dark figures emerge from the woodline and work their way slowly towards the house, almost creeping. I was completely terrified, unsure if I should go wake my husband or just stand my ground. It seems like every time I'd always look back, they would disappear completely into the underbrush, and I never got answers. One incident specifically really terrified me. I saw a few of these figures slowly approaching the house when they vanished. Shortly after, I see this large dark shape in the sky come right over around our property and start emitting these strange red flashing lights. It was like a plane, but much larger and much lower to the ground. It was almost kind of a diamond shape. I kind of went in and out of consciousness. My memory's very blurry, and I'm not exactly sure what happened next because I ran inside. It's a very strange experience. The next day, I became so violently sick, my husband had to take off work and take me to the hospital. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with me, but I nearly died
twice, and I was confined to a hospital bed for 4 to 5 days. I believe that shape in the sky had something to do with it, although I'm not sure. The only other strange account I could possibly recall that I know of in my community is that a young woman, not too long ago, well, before I had my experience, was walking her dog on a sloping hill one evening when she felt something strange in the air, is how she described it, and she sees this large, emaciated dog approaching her. Instead of turning around, the woman said that she just continued walking, picking up her pace because she felt terrified. She said that in response to her picking up her pace, this thing also picked up its pace and began running after her. Now completely terrified, she went as fast as she could, back to the trail where she was on and back to her car, where this thing eventually dove off into the woods. But the entire time, this thing still continued to follow her, making all sorts of horrible growls and noises in the woods, like it did not want her there. She described the creature as looking like a starved dog, hunched over on 2 legs, incredibly ugly, and very frightening looking. We didn't spend too much longer living on that ranch, because me seeing these 3 beings would be a reoccurring thing over and over. Finally, maybe no more than a year later, we moved to a different state entirely. Normally, I'm not really a believer in ghosts, paranormal, UFOs, or aliens, but that experience, now 11 years ago, really completely changed my entire perspective on what I even perceive as normal and our reality. Lastly, let me go ahead and share some details with you that I had written down in my notebook about these 3 beings that I would see over and over again. They were tall, they were very dark, they almost had a very slender and human build, very bulky by the shoulders, and almost a reptilian-like head. Large bulky arms, too long for their body, with hands that were completely oversized, and long white claws. Their faces were very serpentine, but deep-set-in eyes, and teeth that were very reminiscent of a fish. Tiny, but millions of sharp little teeth. Could these creatures have been aliens,